Good evening, everyone. I'd like to call this City of Urbana Council Committee of the Whole meeting to order. I just want to make a note that UPTV is still experiencing some technical difficulties in displaying resolution and ordinance numbers along with the broadcast, so we'll do our best to try and repeat those and keep everyone up to date as to which topics we are talking about. And with that, would the clerk please call the roll?
City Council members Ammons.
Here.
Brown.
Here.
Hazen.
Here.
Jacobson.
Here.
Miller.
Here.
Roberts.
Here.
Wu.
Here.
Mayor Marlin.
Here.
All right, so first up we have to do an approval of minutes from the November 13th, 2017 meeting. Is there a motion to approve the minutes?
I'll make the motion.
I'll second it.
Motion by Dennis and seconded by Dean Hazen. Is there any corrections or anybody catch any mistakes? All right, can we get a vote to approve the minutes? All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, and minutes are approved. All right, are there any additions to the agenda from staff? Seeing none, we have time for public input. I haven't received any cards unless you have some, Mr. Clerk. All right, and we will move on to any presentations. We have a staff report listed after this, but I don't know if anyone else had any presentations. Nope. All right, Mayor Marlin is requested to make a couple announcements prior to our staff report.
Thank you, Jared. I just wanted to let people know that as of last week, our search firm had received 44 applications for the city administrator position. The announcement of the position closes December 8th, and we'll begin evaluating applications after that. But we're very pleased with the number, and I understand the quality of the applications is very good as well. So we'll be working on the next step of this process. Secondly, we just learned that on Friday, December 1st, so that's this Friday at 2:30 p.m., there will be a dedication of a large photo of Abraham Lincoln. This will occur on the first floor in the old courthouse near the Lincoln Museum. This is compliments of the Illinois Historical Society and thanks to a generous donation from Kent and Marilyn Tucker of Rantoul. The photo is of Lincoln right after he received the Republican nomination for president, and it said that it was his favorite likeness of him. But anyway, this is a wonderful addition to the courthouse, and the public is invited to attend this. And on Monday, December 4th at noon, we will be raising the bicentennial flag honoring the anniversary of the birthday of the state of Illinois. So that's at noon, a flag-raising ceremony out front of the city building. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Marlin. All right, so next up we have our staff report, the IDOT Traffic Stop Quarterly Update with a team from the police department.
All right, so there are copies so that everybody can follow along, and then we will return for questions on next Monday, the 4th. So this is the quarterly traffic stop update. This is for data from April to September. And so I'm going to go through briefly the history of what we've got going on here, and then what our most recent data looks like. So in January 2014, City Council established a task force. In October of 2015, recommendations were issued. We've made a progress towards a large number of these recommendations. These are all listed here, and this will be available online after the conclusion of the meeting. In addition to the task force recommendations, we've council and then the police department have also completed a number of things to work towards improvement. And then since the previous quarter, so after the last presentation, we held individual meetings with 5 council members. We discussed recommendations from council and staff for any further changes in city practices and policies to reduce racial disparities relating to traffic stops. These recommendations focused on implicit bias training and then further data analysis. The mayor's office and HRO conducted 3 meetings with local pastors so far. They've discussed traffic stops and also ways to reach community members. The topics that were raised in these meetings consistently by the pastors included property taxes, needs for civic education, issues with property maintenance and property management in the neighborhoods, and needs for jobs. There will be additional meetings that will be held. And then we briefly discussed a new traffic stop video. Filming will kick off soon with HRO and UPD. There's going to be an emphasis on educating younger drivers on the process of a traffic stops. And then the framework for the video. The video has been developed. We've identified the key players, and we'll have a couple of high school students that will be participating. Scheduling has been a bit of an issue, but filming will take place after the first of the year. Okay, so today I'm going to go over the quarterly dashboard with the things that we are tracking on a quarterly basis. I'll present some maps, and then we'll discuss the next steps. So in quarter 2 and quarter 3, we're running from July 1st to September 30th, or a rolling 6 months. So this is what we're comparing for our 5-year average is going to be quarter 2 and quarter 3 from 2012, 13, 14, 15, and 16. And then our comparison on the right is going to be quarter 2 and quarter 3 from 2017. The Z score that is presented on the far right, and sometimes I think it's on the bottom of the slides, indicates how far outside what we would expect based on the past variation is our current numbers. So anything over than 1 is something that we should pay attention to. So in quarter 2 and quarter 3, our 5-year average, we averaged a little over 2,000 traffic stops. This year, we've done a little over 1,200 traffic stops. This is significantly lower than we would expect based on our rolling 5-year average. So that merits looking into a bit further. So I broke it down by quarter. So in quarter 2, going back to 2012, you can see that there's fluctuation, just quarter to quarter basis. But then when we aggregate it to the year, you can see that we've consistently been conducting fewer traffic stops. Traffic stops have decreased every year since 2013. We've been on a downward trend, but still with a month to go in 2017. This data goes all the way up through 11/20. We're still significantly below the average, which is the fine dotted line, which is not quite so visible on the handout, but it should be on the screen. And then looking at the step stops, so that's Selective Traffic Enforcement Program. The step stops as a percentage of total traffic stops are not appearing on here, but let's see, as a percentage of total traffic stops, we're looking at 33.8% is our 5-year average, and 38.63% is our current quarter 2 and quarter 3 for 2017. Overall, there's a lot of variation that occurs in the percentage of step stops. This is not outside what we would expect. Right, so in 2017, so far, we've conducted fewer traffic stops, and of the traffic stops that were conducted, more of them were step stops than non-step stops. And then looking at the reason for stop. This is the legal reason for the stop, whether it's a moving violation, equipment violation, a license or registration violation, or a commercial violation. We don't do hardly any commercial violations, so that has been excluded. We've had no significant changes for quarters 2 and 3 in 2017. So moving violation hovers around 72%, equipment violation hovers around 19%, and then license and registration violation is 8 to 9%. And about 50% of the equipment violations for the reason for stop are for headlights and taillights. And then the motivation for the stop. We started tracking that in May of 2015 as the result of the recommendation from the IDOT task force. There were some inconsistencies in data collection, and then there was retraining, and so the retraining it was concluded at the end of 2015. So the data that's presented is just from 2016 and 2017. So there's not a Z-score because I'm just comparing one year to the next. So we see we've got more traffic issues this year than we had last year. We've got fewer community caretaking this year than we had last year, and fewer targeted patrol stops than we did last year. As a reminder, a traffic problem is just the motivation of reducing the number and severity of motor vehicle crashes. A targeted patrol is with the motivation of investigating a specific incident, and then community caretaking is the motivation of educating a driver. And now to talk about the disparity ratio. We decided after extensive discussion that the benchmark that we're using, or the baseline that we're using for the drivers that are on city streets are accidents. So that's going to be our proxy measure for the people that are driving on the streets, and then we know how many people that we're stopping by race, and so doing a division, so taking the percentage of individuals that we're stopping divided by the percentage of individuals that we're estimating are driving is what gives us a disparity ratio. And so a disparity ratio of 1 would be we would be stopping the exact number of people by ratio that we would expect based on who's driving on the streets. So this is our historical look at what our disparity ratio has been traditionally. This is broken down by race, so it's not simply minority versus Caucasian. By disaggregating it this way, we can see that African American disparity ratio is consistently higher than any other racial group, and then the yellow line represents 1, so that would be equally likely to be stopped. So here is what we're looking at for 2017. We're looking at Q2 and Q3 of 2012 to 2016 compared to Q2 and Q3 of 2017. So in Q2 and Q3, African American drivers of this year were 66% more likely than expected to be stopped, and Caucasians were 12% less likely to be stopped than we would expect based on the driving population. The increase from what we saw in the past 5 years, which was 56% more likely, to what we see now is 66% more likely, it's outside of what we would expect based on the past fluctuations from the last 5 years. When I look at it a little bit closer, the increase is driven by Q2. The disparity ratio in Q2 was 1.79, and then in Q3 it was 1.54. Next, we're going to look at the outcome of the stop. The outcome is the most serious outcome from the traffic stop. So the unit of analysis is the stop. There can be more than one charge. You could receive a ticket and a warning. You could receive something that's more serious than a traffic stop and a warning. I'm interested in the most serious outcome from the stop. Overall, what we see most often is a citation, followed by a warning, and followed by something that is more serious than a traffic violation. So with this, we can calculate. There's not a proxy measure for our baseline. We know the percentage of people that we're stopping based on race, and then we know the outcome from that. So this is solid. There's no statistical imputation that occurs here. So the racial disparity of outcomes is fairly equally distributed across races. Hispanic drivers are more likely to receive a citation and less likely to receive a warning, and Asian drivers are more likely to receive a warning. So when we look at changes over time, this is a big chart here, but looking at citations, so we can see, so what we want to pay attention to here is the Z-score. If anything is outside of 1, that it's significantly more or less likely than we would expect based on the past fluctuations. So even a really small change in numbers, so Caucasian for citation goes from our average of 1.04, or 4% more likely than we would expect based on the racial makeup of the individuals that we've stopped, to 1.01. It's a difference of 3, so that's significantly outside what we would expect because the number stays so static over time. So this reinforces that this is a really good tool to use to monitor change over time. The disparity ratios are more skewed at the levels of more serious than traffic violation. So looking closer at those violations, there were 64 in quarter 2 and quarter 3 that were more serious than a traffic violation. Those would fall under things like no insurance, a revoked or suspended license, revoked or suspended registration, warrants, driving under the influence or drugs. And then from that, only about half of those people are arrested. So in quarters 2 and quarter 3, we took 29 people to jail that started as a traffic stop. Those were warrants, DUIs. Almost all of the arrests that we conduct after a traffic stop are non-discretionary, so they're felony arrests, and then warrants. One of the questions from the follow-up meetings that we had were to consider the type of warrants. I'm not able to do this within my data, and I did speak to the state's attorney's office, and there's not a good way to match our data to theirs to determine the types of warrant arrests that are occurring. But it's a non-discretionary. If there's a warrant, it does result in an arrest. So one of the things that we had uncovered previously was that the disparity ratio between the step stops and the non-step stops are different. We see less disparity in the step stops and more disparity in the non-step stops. So I'm using a larger pool here. This is not just the the quarter 2 and quarter 3. This is full 2 years worth of data, because what I'm doing is we're pulling apart about less than half of the traffic stops, and then we're breaking it down by race, so it's problematic to have numbers that small. So we're looking at the number of stops is quite a bit higher than the numbers that we've been working with in the past. The step patrol areas are decided by a sergeant, and those are usually based on input from the Traffic Commission and from citizen complaints, traffic crash reports. So those are focused on traffic interactions that usually have the potential to lead to an accident. So we see more disparity in areas or in traffic stops that are conducted outside of the steps patrols. So now we're going to move on to the maps, and this is the full 2 years worth of data, so that we can have a large enough baseline to be able to plot this. These are the density analysis. This is the density or kernel density of all traffic stops. So this takes all of the stops that we've conducted over the city, and then it color concentrates it, so the darker spots are areas where we've conducted more stops. And then similar to last time, I've broken it down by African American drivers versus Caucasian drivers. Overall, this is fairly similar. They're concentrated in almost all of the same areas, but we do see some differences. The density of African American drivers stopped. There are areas that are on Washington, over here on Bradley, and then Goodwin is over here somewhere. And then Caucasian drivers concentrate more here on Windsor than what we see in other places. And so when we're looking at our citizen-initiated calls for service, I was able to do the same density analysis using the same dates. These are responses by patrol officers that are not officer-initiated. So I'm not including traffic stops. I'm not including foot patrol. I'm not including follow-ups. This is an imperfect measure, but it's pretty close to when a citizen calls us to respond to a call for service. When we overlay this with census blocks, and I was able to do it down to the block level, not the block group level. I was able to use some more nuanced data. We see that most of this concentrates in areas of high African American population. So the darker shaded areas have a higher percentage of African American residents that reported to the census. When we overlay this with our non-step, so the traffic stops that we see the most disparity in, stops with African American drivers, overlaid with citizen-initiated calls for service, on top of where the population, or where the high population of African Americans live. It lines up. So we are patrolling in areas that have high concentration of calls for service. We're patrolling in areas that have high concentration of African American residents. African Americans are living in our community, are more likely to live in areas of higher citizen-initiated calls for service, based on the data that we have available, and this is consistent with data that we see across the nation. And our non-step patrol stops are concentrated in areas where we respond to the most citizen-initiated calls for service. So as a summary, in quarters 2 and 3 of 2017, we've conducted significantly fewer traffic stops. There was no change in the motivation for stop, the reason for stop, or the percentage of step traffic stops. There was an increase in African American disparity ratio and a decrease in the Asian disparity ratio. The increase in African American disparity ratio was predominantly driven by Q2 disparity, and we do see a higher African American disparity ratio in non-step stops. We do see fluctuations in disparity ratio for citation and warning outcomes, but that stays pretty close to 1. And then spatially, traffic stops for African American drivers are concentrated in areas with high citizen-initiated calls for service and high African American census populations. So for our next steps, I will return for a follow-up discussion on December 4th. We're making some data quality improvements to begin on January 1st. The Beyond Scope checkbox that we added is currently hand tallied, so that will be digitized, and I'll be able to pull the data from that without actually having to look at the traffic tickets. And then there's going to be an additional data entry for differentiation of search types. So we don't do very many searches now, but the ones that we do, I can look at what's consent search and what's not consent search, but I can't break it down further than that. I know whether it's a search, but I don't know whether it's incident to arrest or whether it's probable cause or whether it's incident to tow. So these are things that will allow me to look at the traffic stop data better. The mayor's office and the HRO will continue discussions with local pastors and community members. HRO and UPD will begin traffic stop video filming, and then Urbana Police Department will be working with the University of Illinois on a National Institute of Justice grant that will include citizen surveys and interviews of key stakeholders and community members in crime hotspots or areas where we see high concentration of calls for service. Work on that begins January 1.
So I think this would be a good time. I want to expound upon that particular, that grant opportunity, because it kind of plays into this a little bit. So I'd like to invite Dr. Schlosser from the Police Training Institute up to speak to that a little bit more.
Thanks, Chief. Thank you, everybody, for having me here tonight. This is an absolutely amazing opportunity, not only for the city of Urbana, but also for the University of Illinois. And what has happened here is the University of Illinois, in partnership with the Urbana Police Department, has recently been awarded a Department of Justice grant through the National Institute. The National Institute of Justice, and I think that the grant was titled "Understanding the Impacts of Policing Strategies and Practices Beyond Crime Reduction." And just to let you know, to actually get a grant from the Department of Justice is nothing that's simple by any means. There's so much competition, and generally speaking, those grants are given to bigger cities like Chicago, New York, Baltimore, and places like that. So for Urbana to be chosen for such a significant grant, which will basically pay for the entire research project, is pretty amazing. And I think we owe a lot of the work on that to Melissa. So good job, Melissa. This program, or this research project, is titled Infusing Community Policing Strategy into Hotspots Policing Practices, the impacts on police-community relations in mid-sized cities. Now, there's been a lot of, and you guys, I think, from what I understand, are familiar with hotspots. You were, okay. So many research projects have been proven to be effective in hotspots. But what most agencies have done to reduce the crime is they have taken a very extreme enforcement action. You know, we go in, we make arrests, and we reduce the crime. And, you know, but that also has the potential of over-policing certain groups, you know, marginalized, underprivileged, oppressed areas. And so that seems to be an issue that needs to be resolved. And so what we have chosen here to do is, in these hot spots, so it won't be going in and being super proactive and fighting crime and making a bunch of arrests and getting rid of the crime that way. So it's going to consist mostly of saturating them with community policing and different aspects of community policing, and having officers in these hot spots go in, and there's a lot more to it. But to keep it simple, if police officers go into communities and I'm sorry, I'm suffering from a cold today, so, but they go into these various communities and they perform community policing. And then the easiest way to understand one of the most important aspects of community policing is what we call non-enforcement actions, right? Non-enforcement contacts. So police so many times have, their primary or sometimes only contacts they have with police are when they're called, right? When you get those calls for service, when it's a domestic, when it's a disturbance, when it's a problem. And so this will allow the police to go into the communities, practice their community policing skills, not enforcing the laws, not making the arrests, but getting out of their cars and getting to know people. And to keep it very simple, if police officers are people too, right? We have families, we have similar hobbies, we have similar interests as citizens. We're not just cops. So if we get out of our cars and we start interacting with people and they get to know me as, Mike, instead of Officer Schlosser, they get to know me as a person, and I have conversations. I get to know them as people. And you start developing these relationships with people and start gaining the trust of citizens. This is a way that's going to have a lot of benefits, whether it's just gaining the trust of citizens, or actually finding ways to resolve problems through community policing. Then, we think that we will, have a lot of positive outcomes from this. So this is what makes this unique. We could go in and we could say, okay, we're going to just get out there and arrest everybody we see, and it's going to reduce the crime. Or we can get out there and we can get to know people as people. They can get to know us as people, and we can make those contacts and gain the trust of citizens. So that's a big part of it. Do you want me to explain the three groups?
Yeah,
Okay.
go ahead.
So how this is going to work is, so randomly chosen hotspots will have different things going on. So, for example, certain hotspots, they'll be doing primarily community policing, nothing but community policing. Certain officers will be designated after being trained to go out and be these community police officers and having these positive interactions with people. And then another group, we will have what's called targeted patrol, some call it directed patrol, but that targeted patrol is, again, not in a way to go out and fight crime and make arrests and put people in jail and things like that. It'll just simply be more visibility. They won't be doing the community policing, but they will have more visibility in these hot spots. And then, of course, there'll be a control group where business is as usual. So all of this will be analyzed through a mixed method approach using qualitative and quantitative data, and to find out what kind of results we're going to get from these. So I think it's because of the way that we, and again Melissa had a lot to do with this, have chosen in today's world. I think one of the most important aspects in the policing profession today is actually going out and gaining the trust of citizens, and getting that police legitimacy back, and this is a way of doing it. And then these, of course, through research, will be analyzed for that. Did you want to add something to that? Or?
No.
Training at all?
Sylvia,
Questions?
Melissa,
Yes.
you guys good?
Yeah. Actually, one of our partners is Jeff Martin. Dr. Jeff Martin from Anthropology is here. Would you like to come up and? Sorry. Is that okay? Can we pull another?
Thank you. Yeah, Professor.
Thank you, yeah.
So this is Dr. Jeff Martin. He's one of our co-principal investigators, and he is with the Department of Anthropology, and he will be running the qualitative side and going in and doing focus groups and interviews and an ethnographic look at some of the citizen perceptions.
And I brought some students who will also be working on the project.
Very good.
Great, awesome.
Okay.
Sorry.
Did you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Sure, I'd tell you anything you'd like to know. So we're going to go into the neighborhoods and talk to people and find out what they think, as anthropologists often do, and we'll do that over time. So we'll see if their opinions change at all. That's the basic gist of the project. Yeah.
Okay, I think we've sparked a lot of interest in council, so we'll take some questions. Eric, I saw your hand first.
Are the folks who came in with you students who will be working on this?
Well, some of them are students that are going to work on it. These are just, I actually had to end my class a little bit early, and I issued an open invitation to the entire class, anyone that wanted to come to a city council meeting and learn a little bit about the project was welcome to come, so
Great.
not all of them are specific to the project.
Well, welcome. We'll try to behave ourselves. But I did write down 3 questions during the course of the presentations. If I could, I'll go through those.
Please.
So we have noticeably fewer stops this year than in previous years.
Yes.
I could imagine 3 reasons for that. One is people are driving more safely and keeping their cars in better shape. 2 would be, for some reason, there's a higher threshold for a stop for something being wrong. I guess one trigger or one mirror for that would be either accidents or crime statistics. Do we see if the police are not policing as thoroughly, then we might see more accidents, we might see an uptick in crime statistics. Have you looked at that with respect to these same time periods?
Yeah, so accidents are fairly stable across time. Crime and calls for service in general have gone down.
Okay, that's great. I'd love to see an electronic copy of the Justice Department proposal. Since it's been granted, I guess that's freely available to distribute?
We can write something up.
Okay, great. Yeah, I think funded proposals to the
Are they?
federal government
Okay,
are
absolutely.
everybody in the world is entitled to see, including us. And one of you mentioned a recommendation on reducing penalties for marijuana or paraphernalia possession.
Mhm.
And when we made that recommendation, and I remember on the traffic stop task force being involved in writing that recommendation and then passing that recommendation once we got to the council. And one of the things that people said to us as to say that this wasn't a good idea is, well, you know what's going to happen. The police are going to charge a state statute instead of a municipal ordinance violation. And so people will actually get hurt rather than have the lighter penalty. The reason we went for the lighter penalty, I just want everybody to recall, is that the statistics are clear that marijuana usage is pretty much even between whites and blacks. But marijuana busts are not even. So we would have been happy to make marijuana penalty 0. Legal advised us not to take it to 0, so we made it pretty low. And but how have the police responded? Have they been moving to statutory charges, or are they doing what we had hoped they would do, which is actually reduce the penalties?
Well, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I suspect that they are continuing to do what they did before and just a lower penalty. I don't believe, I have no information about our arrest for possession of marijuana going up significantly.
No, I know drug crime is down as a whole, but I can run it specifically for
Yeah.
the marijuana ordinance violations, and I can bring that back on the 4th.
Okay, thank you.
Aaron?
Yeah, I'll just jump in now. Thank you all for the presentation. Doc, good to see you again. Just one of the things in relationship to the marijuana information, it was supposed to be tracked and presented to us as well to see if there was going to be any particular change. But you saying you don't have that information?
Not tonight, not during the IDOT update, and if that was a request, I was unaware of it, so it's certainly something that we can do.
So I remember a pretty extensive conversation about this because I don't know if it was Bill or somebody else who raised that particular concern, and we thought that we could trust that the department would just continue to do much along the lines of what you just shared, but I'd like to see what that actual data is, and I thought that was pretty clearly communicated then, that we would see that just to make sure we can track it. I could recall, I don't know if it was you or Melissa, or someone saying that we'll make sure we get that information to make sure we are not doing it different. So I look forward to seeing it as well, if that's okay, if I can get that, if I can have that information.
I'm happy to bring
sent
it
to me.
on the board.
Thank you. You said that accidents have stayed the same and that the crime rate is down, although the stops are down, right?
Correct.
But I thought we said that or you all presented that the crime areas, thank you, the high crime areas were increasing, or basically that was the reason for the stops.
So
Right.
the number of calls for service overall has decreased. The concentration has stayed the same. So crime is not equally distributed across the city. It concentrates in certain geographic areas, and the concentration that we're seeing is consistent, and there are perpetual hotspots that we see over time, similar to accidents. We always have accidents at the same intersections, and regardless of if it goes up or down, it's usually at the same spot. So it's similar with crime. The concentration or the density analysis shows where crime is concentrated, not necessarily where everything is occurring as a grid, but where it's concentrated within that.
So one of the things that I'm trying to make sure that I get clear, because I'm not quite sure who I should pose my questions to, because I sort of see you, Melissa, as the statistician and to sort of crunch the numbers, but questions in relationship to policing, I'm sort of expecting Sylvia to respond to those. So right now, the STEP and non-STEP program, for instance, and forgive me if my questions are all over the place, I'm just seeing this information for the first time, so I'm trying to process that. The STEPs and the non-STEP, how do you explain the disparity between the two?
So step stop. Do you want to go?
That's all right. I think she said which is one of the issues with step locations are predetermined. They're not. There is no. It's not a discretionary thing. So if they're assigned to run radar on Lincoln Avenue because we have perpetual speeders on Lincoln Avenue, that's where they have to go and sit and run radar. If they're tasked to do a seatbelt or cell phone violations at 5 points, then that's where they're directed to go, and that's where they have to stay. They don't venture off of where they're supposed to be. So those are less discretionary as far as the location in which the officers are going to be making the stops, whereas the non-step stops are being made in the patrol areas where the officers are patrolling.
So a non-step stop just simply means that this is the officer's discretion.
Correct. They're in their beat. There's 5 different beats in the city, and they're patrolling their beat, and that's where they're making those stops, or to and from the station or something like that. But yes, they can go in a bigger area than where they're directed to during a step detail.
So is it your position, with the support of the statistician, that the reason that African Americans are stopped more than any other ethnic group consistently in the city of Urbana is because of the calls for service in those? Is that your position? Is that what you all are trying to communicate to us?
I believe that is one of the factors. One of the main factors is that's where we're policing, because that's where we're at more, and so we are seeing more violations there and stopping more people there, yes.
Is that the only reason that you would offer as the reason for the disparity?
I'm not going to say that is the only possible reason, no.
Since we've been working on implicit bias training, do you think implicit bias has anything to do with the disparity?
It's a possibility.
I don't know, I guess I think if we're going to spend time doing the training, and Dr. Schlosser, certainly I appreciate any of your comments around implicit bias, because I think it's extremely important for us to understand and for the community to understand that implicit bias, how it relates to race, sexism, various different isms within our society, and how that plays out. And if we're saying that our department is doing the implicit bias training in relationship to race and other things, but in particular because of this issue, then there has to be some way for us to gauge where we are with that and if the reasoning behind some of these stops is associated with implicit bias.
So what I'll say is I think we recognize implicit bias training is important. It's certainly not something that you're going to go to one training session about it and totally understand and completely erase that. It's not possible to do that. I also think that as a way of gauging whether or not we're making any improvements on that is something that is definitely going to be long term. It's not going to be a 12-month period whether we can see as we continue to give the training annually whether or not we're having a impact on that particular thing. I think is going to be something that is going to have to be gauged over a longer period of time. We can't change things overnight. I just don't think that's I just don't think that's reasonable to expect that. So that's kind of at least my thoughts on that, and based on my understanding of implicit bias and the training that I have gotten as well, is this is something that is much more long-term. You want to say something? Sure.
Yeah, I think this is something you and I have talked about quite a bit, and implicit bias is real. And it can have to do with race, it can have to do with age, it can have to do with gender. We all have assumptions, biases, and stereotypes based on every life experience we have. And if you think about an entire life of that, it is something that's difficult. And keep in mind, implicit bias means it's somewhat unconscious, right, or the subconscious. But I think we're getting better at improving our training, and I've been working with Professor Sundiata Chajwa and Helen Neville on this, and we are, it's also a research project with us, and we are doing certain pre and post measurements with our recruits as we give them their additional 10 hours of policing in a multiracial society. And the thing that we have found about implicit bias is there's several different types of studies. It's something that, first of all, I think you just need to be aware of it and own it. But then again, I think that training beyond the implicit bias to help reduce implicit bias, not even necessarily related directly to implicit bias. So, for example, if we are, have certain trainings that we're going through so that we are, making traffic stops or making personal stops, whether it's a consent stop or an investigative stop and things like that, I think that if we learn through the practice of how we talk to people, how we do our job, and if we're following all the proper procedures, there are steps that can be taken in training to make sure that you are being fair and impartial. So it's a combination of training. It's implicit bias. There have been some studies that have shown that it can be unlearned in certain areas. And I think there was one really good research project done with the New York PD. They had a group go through an entire semester. So again, like the chief says, it's difficult when there's only so much training, but I think we're starting to plant the seed. We're starting to realize that this is real and this is something we need to continue to work on, and it's very difficult to do. And to be able to measure whether this plays a part in the decision that the police officer makes is hard to tell. So, until there's probably, better research out there and research building upon research, you know, it's going to take a while to get that.
Well, you know, I certainly appreciate that.
Yeah.
And what you said initially and what we've talked about over time through our conversations is that, first of all, you have to own it.
Yeah.
And so what I'm sharing or what I'm trying to present is that what I tend to feel when we have these conversations or the feedback that I get is that there is a unwillingness to actually own it, right? There's an explanation from hotspots and step stops and various other different things, but what you said is implicit bias is very real, right? And we all have it. So that means that the officers or any of us, staff members, all of us, would have some level of implicit bias. And if we have a force that is primarily made of Caucasian officers who all have implicit bias, then we may not be able to pinpoint exactly if this officer was operating on implicit bias in that stop. But it's certainly easy for us to conclude that implicit bias plays a part in the disparity that we see. And if we're not willing to say that, then I don't know if we're willing to own it, right? So that's the thing that I'm trying to get across, for us to own it, and then we can actually move forward. If we do that, I think we start to have a different level or different type of conversation. So I appreciate you sharing that.
If I could just add, yeah, I think that owning it is important, understanding it is important, and trying to you know, kind of dig deep into not only yourself, but how did I grow up, what are my influences, and things like that. But it's through training that has been proven in some studies that we base things on behavior and not race, and that's you know, that's another part of the training. You know, things are based on behavior, and the more training you get, the more you're going to base your decisions on behavior, because you're getting this repetition of training. So this is what I see, this is what's happening, this is the high-stress situation, this is a shoot, don't shoot situation, but through training and training and training, it's very possible that, you know, that implicit bias, whether it exists or not, you've trained so, you know, so hard, scenario-based training and things like that, that it just becomes more automatically to base it on behavior and not race. So there's a lot of things that we're working on right now to try to improve that. So I agree.
So I appreciate that. My other question was in relationship to the hotspot, not hotspot policing, but the calls for service.
Yes.
Right. And if the position is that the stops are taking place in these particular spaces because there's more calls for service. Actually, what was presented through the IDOT information and what I think Mr. Cruz shared at the July 24th meeting was that more data and more of this research shows that it's actually demographics and where people of color live that drive the disparity more so than the crime in that particular area. So I just wanted to know if you all had any comments on that.
I guess I'm not sure what the question is. Do I agree with something that Mr. Cruz said, or is my position still that we're stopping people where the calls for service are?
Well, I guess you could frame it as whether or not you agree with something that Mr. Cruz said or not. But have you read the other information in relationship to demographics being more of the driving force that determine the disparity for African American drivers as opposed to the crime analysis or narrative that is often put forward?
May I read the bit from the report that you're referring to? The traffic stop data show that African American drivers are more likely to be stopped by the police. The fact that minorities live in neighborhoods with a larger police presence almost certainly increases the rates at which they are stopped. Whether these disparities also reflect evidence of racial profiling is more difficult to say. And that's the bit from the previous report. So there was a lot of analysis that went along with that, and the summary was complex social problems rarely have simple answers, and that's what the finding from the previous one was too, and that's, you know, we echo that here. So there's disparity in step stops also. There's more disparity in non-step stops. So there's disparity across the board, and there has been for a while. It's lower than it was in the past, but it's still there. So it's. Yeah.
And so we have the data, whether it's the community members, the task force, the statistician with a new methodology, the disparity is there. And I don't understand, even in the step stops, there's a disparity. So there's no, I mean, I don't have the answer to that. I'm asking you guys to offer an actual answer to why that is so.
You're asking me why there's a disparity versus what we can do to try to change it. I think we've talked, what the focus has been is, okay, there's a disparity, and I don't think anybody has said that there isn't. And now what can we do to try to make some kind of a change in that that's long-term versus not just, you know, Q2 was high for some reason, but that was kind of out of context with Q1 and Q3, you know, over the long term, can we get this, can we make some changes to this? And I think that's where, when we had our individual meetings with several council members, we were asking, like, help us out with this. Give me some ideas. What are things that we can do that are reasonable, that we can try to help make this change? In addition to the implicit bias training that we're doing, I think this grant is a phenomenal thing that initially we thought we did not get. They published a list of people and said we didn't get it. We're like, okay. And then next thing you know, we actually got some. And I'm like, this is good because this helps us with some of the things overall that we're trying to change and things that we're trying to do differently, and being able to focus on those areas where we have the higher calls for service. Can we make some kind of swing, some kind of change in the dynamic that has taken years and decades to get to this point? So that's what I think we're trying to work on, and that's why we had meetings and we're trying to brainstorm on how can we do, what other things can we do that we can help change that is something reasonable within our grasp that we can do.
Yeah. So I think we also have to realize that the disparities in the criminal justice system, and when we start talking about implicit bias or explicit bias or racism and things like that, that it is a societal problem. It's not just a police problem. And what makes it a little different for police is because police officers have the power to arrest and take people's rights away from them. And I think, you know, part of community policing, and I will be training the ones going out and doing this community policing in the hot spots, and when there's a program called Procedural Justice, and I will be training them on that. Implicit bias, of course, but community policing, in order to improve the community, is, I think, a big step, because so many people, whether it's in urban Chicago and certain areas where people do not have the same opportunities as other people might. But to resolve the problems, it can't just be the police. I mean, part of community policing is to train police officers, you know, to have those interactions with citizens, but at the same time, it has to be a collaboration with police, citizens, social service organizations, other organizations, schools, government. Let's find out what the problems in these areas are. Let's see how we can help improve life in those areas, how we can give people more opportunities, how we can just, you know, provide certain areas with ways to just improve so that maybe they're no longer a hot spot. So, I mean, it takes, that's part of community policing. It's the government, it's businesses, it's schools, it's everybody. So, you know, police need help beyond police, and you know, and like the chief said, I mean, I tell you, the chief should be commended for really working hard, trying to brainstorm and bringing this project in. And you know, I've talked to the chief many times, known her for years, and she truly cares and wants to help solve this problem. So I think it's kind of multifaceted, and I think that it's, you know, society, we all need to.
Well, I definitely understand that there's a large array of things that we could do to help poor communities and things like that, right? I'm not sure if community policing is something that, I think it works, right, from what I understand about it, right? But it's not much different than what policing basically used to be, right? The way it's being described, that we have relationships with officers, we know them by name, we know where they live. They live in the community they police, right? You know, so if we're going to discuss community policing, does that also include a conversation about police officers living in the communities that they police? Or is that off limits because of contractual reasons and things like that? I think that's a very important question, though, then, right? If we're talking about community policing and building relationships, right? So I'm open to that. I'm not quite sure why, you know, I have a very vivid memory of some officers jumping out on Busey Avenue one day of their squad car and throwing a couple of snowballs at somebody, right? And it was just a community interaction, right? You know what I mean? Seeing them as people, I've never forgotten it, right? And the young kids who were outside in their front yard probably have never forgotten it either, because it was the type of interaction that was non-enforcement. It was along those lines of community policing. I don't understand why we can't do that now. Community policing doesn't mean that you're going to ignore situations, crimes that we see committed, right? It doesn't mean that, does it? No. So I'm not quite sure why we can't implement some of those particular things prior to a grant coming forward and us being able to address those concerns. So I don't want to keep going on, but I have questions that I just haven't had a chance to get answered. Who were the pastors that you've met with?
Well, I have had conversations with pastors, but the meetings that she was talking to were with the mayor and the HRO officer, I believe.
Okay.
Yeah. I was not invited to those.
I personally met with Pastor Holmes and Pastor Jenkins, and then there have been 2 other follow-up meetings with small groups of 2 to 3 people.
Other pastors?
Mhm. I can get you the names. I wasn't able to attend those, but Preston James and Basilia have
So-
been those.
I know in July 24th of 2017, we said that there were going to be actual community meetings. That's what the mayor said would take place, and that Preston and Basilia would facilitate those. Have we had any of those community meetings?
Not yet.
Because they were supposed to take place in September or October, according to what was shared in July.
It took longer than expected to set up the initial meetings.
So in the meetings with the pastors, was the topic the traffic stop data, or just in general? Because what was presented in the report didn't speak to traffic stop data.
It initially was, but the conversations consistently turned to those other factors that are present in the neighborhoods, and that their concerns were with issues like issues with property maintenance, with management of rental properties, with crime in the neighborhoods, with high property taxes, the need for jobs, and it's the same, actually it's the very same issues that have been raised in every neighborhood that I've ever had a meeting in my experience with the council. So we were very consistent concerns that were wider than traffic stops.
So I understand it, and I think all those things need to be discussed, but if the objective is to talk to the local African-American community, in particular these pastors that spoke up or that you met with, then the topic should be about the traffic stop data, right? That's what we said we were going to talk about. That's what we said we were going to take out into the community, or what you said we were going to do. So I'm just saying that I'm saying this and laying this foundation because what was suggested from the task force was also the commission. And we've had a lot of pushback as to whether or not we should actually do this commission. But since July 24th of 2017, I don't know how many, I don't think we've discussed as a council the traffic stop data. We certainly haven't had any special sessions or any closed sessions to have any conversations about the traffic stop data, to analyze it, to digest it, to make any recommendations to the UPD. So who's going to do that if we don't have the commission to actually spend the time and dedicate the time to analyze the data and make the recommendations to the UPD, and instead leave Sylvia in a situation where she's trying to find some sort of way to address it, but not getting any recommendations, right? So I'm laying a framework that says that the commission would be helpful. Anyway, we talked about the beats, and you said that there were no, there's one beat, one officer per beat, basically, right?
It depends on what staffing is for the day, but generally, yes, there is one per beat, and then there may be a backup officer, a cover officer for like the north side, and then one for the south side to like be a backup for those. It just depends on how many officers are working any particular shift.
And so in the beat where the policing is taking place, I believe Councilman Jacobson had referred to in that last meeting that there are hot spots within that beat, and that's where the concentration or the focus of the officer is. Is that correct?
Yes.
Is the officer instructed to do more patrol stops in those areas?
No.
It just results in more stops in those areas.
Yes.
But the step stops typically show that the driving, basically the driving infractions are less, it's less of a disparity if you just use step. So in that hot spot sort of policing, what you're using is officer discretion that changes that from 1.44 to 1.61 or something like that, right?
I suppose that's one way of looking at it, yes.
What would be the other way?
Well, I mean, what you're saying that their discretion on who they stop is what's changing the disparity versus them, if they're policing in a hot spot and it's predominantly African American, then that tends to raise the chances of being stopped if you're African American higher than if you were in a less predominantly populated area by African Americans. I'm not sure I said that exactly right.
I think I understand your
okay.
point, but all I'm saying is that the difference between step and non-step is discretion.
Yes, that is what I'm saying. They don't have discretion to go to another area. So yes, I guess.
So
For the area.
If we have step analysis that shows that we're 44% more likely to be stopped than what we should be, and then non-step shows 61% more likely to be stopped than we should be, then that discrepancy, that difference is based upon what do I just use? The discretion of the officer, right?
I don't necessarily agree with that statement, no.
But the only difference between step and non-step is discretion.
The discretion of the area on where they're at, not the discretion of who they stop.
Okay, so that's a clear
I
point.
think that's two different things, yes.
Okay, so when you say they have discretion, you're saying on location, but they don't have discretion on who they stop.
Well, they do. I'm just saying that's not the only thing contributing to that.
To
I'm not
the
going to
difference.
agree, yes, with that's the only reason.
I think I understand
Okay,
your point.
Okay,
Okay. All right, I'm okay for now.
okay.
Thank you, Mr. Evans. Mr. Roberts.
Well, first of all, thanks for bringing this topic back to us. Obviously, it's going to take some time to work through the most effective way of addressing it. The fact that we have this grant now is encouraging. I sometimes think that I guess when we arrive at a study and we have a grant, it has the officiality of making the results something that we can defend and talk about. So there's value in that. Although I would think that a group of 15 people in a room who talked directly to the issues with open consciousness could arrive at the same conclusions that a study that takes 6 months could come to. It seems to me that a lot of us, some of us, might have direct perception into what could be happening without accumulating the data that directs us to that same result. But the fact that we're going to be taking this action is fine with me. I think there's a lot of importance about language and the meaning of language when it's being used during a traffic stop by an officer. So I want to ask Sylvia, I guess, if when a traffic stop's occurring, is there a rote, not a rote perhaps, but a learned procedural manner of addressing the client in the car which is consistent?
Yes, we subscribe to an 8-step traffic stop protocol when we're doing that. And would you like to expound upon that? And we teach this in PTI.
Yes, so we teach a specific way to address every traffic stop. And it would go something like this. Good afternoon, I'm Officer Schlosser with the Rantoul Police Department. The reason I stopped you is such and such. Is there any justification for that? Okay.
You would ask that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah, we tell them why we stopped them because people want to know. We don't want them, anxious about that.
Mhm.
And we don't say legal justification because maybe there is justification. Maybe somebody's in the back seat giving birth, right? Okay, for
Okay.
example.
All right.
And then, we will ask for their driver's license and insurance, and we try to make it a habit to say things like, do you have your driver's license with you? And before you reach for that, where do you keep it? Okay, go ahead and get that for me.
Mhm.
And if it could be also a very common thing, is there anything in the vehicle I need to worry about? Do you have any weapons or anything I should be worried about? And if you do these things with every single person, they're not going to think, okay, you think I have a weapon because. So, all right, do you have your insurance card with you, and where do you keep that? Is there anything in the glove box I need to worry about? It's blah, blah, blah. And so then you just go through these different steps and, I'll be back with you and stay in your vehicle, just for safety purposes. And then you just go through these. It's the same exact thing with everybody you stop. You say the same things. And Urbana is one of the few departments in the nation that not only sticks with the 8-step, to my knowledge, and I believe this is true, they randomly pick and watch vehicle traffic stops.
Yeah.
Then you're not treating
It's true.
people differently because there was a recent study where, based on body camera study, that African Americans were treated differently on traffic stops on what was said and how they were treated compared to someone who's white. So that's something that's not going to happen in Urbana because we teach it at PTI, they send them to PTI, and they monitor that. And that all goes along with the communications of other things too. If somebody's angry and yelling at you, we use deflection phrases or empathy phrases they call in counseling, and so it's the same thing every time.
So that gives me an assurance then that there is a verbal train which is measured and just and doesn't show that we have an officer who's ad-libbing or being spontaneous in how he interacts with the individuals who he stops.
Right. I
So
mean, there
as far as we
there
know.
could be other conversations coming up.
Sure.
I see you have a Cubs hat on, or you're a Cubs fan, and just having a conversation
All
about
right,
that.
but at least
But it's
we have a procedure
It
where
is, yeah,
we're supposedly applying it evenly throughout all the experiences we have.
Yes.
Okay, I think it's very important because inflection and language choice, word choice, is a very can easily fall into racial significance or disparity significance. So I wanted to ask about that. So, I mean, and this comes to my mind also because you mentioned before that one of the hallmarks or the goals of your intent is procedural justice,
Yes.
which I am going to assume means that when any events are evolving, that appropriate steps are always being taken that are fair and just, unless I have that misunderstood.
No, that's correct. Yeah, and there's quite a bit to the curriculum, but it basically is, treating everyone the same, and fair and impartial policing, transparency, and just treating people with dignity and respect. And we really emphasize, because we know police officers are human, right?
Right.
And if somebody is angry with you because you're writing them a ticket, they may be yelling, they may be using curse words.
Right.
But we train officers that they're not mad at you, they're mad at the situation, they're mad that they were driving too fast, so we don't take it personal.
Right, that's a
So-
professional,
Yeah, so
that's a
we-
professionalism of service.
And we have actual phrases we use. Sir, I can see you're upset, I probably would be too, I understand that, but if I could just get your driver's license from you, I can get you out of here a lot sooner. I mean, this is just stuff, repetition that we practice all the time through the academy, and these are things that I can guarantee the Urbana PD does, and if they go through their videos and somebody's not doing that and they're having problems with it, then they address it.
Well, and I appreciate the fact that we actually do have reviews, random reviews of traffic stops, and that they're evaluated, and officers may or may not be advised because of how they are professionally doing their job. So, I mean, does that then leave us with the fact that any disparities that occur then have more to do with the content of or the actual events that are uncovered during the traffic stop, i.e., the officer does indeed find that there is an infraction of the law, or that there is a just cause for detaining the individual, or whatever they do, issuing a ticket. So so if the procedure is being handled justly, then is it the results of the discovery or the revelation that then lead to disparity?
Are you asking because if we pull someone over, we have probable cause to stop them. They've already committed whatever
Something.
infraction is we're
Right,
stopping them
right.
for. Now, as far as the results, I
Well,
think.
well, I guess that's
That's
true even if the taillight's out, you're saying?
Correct.
Okay.
Yes, unless, I believe that we had a slide on the outcome ratio. I don't remember which slide it was, but if that's what if that was the second part of your question, maybe
I guess.
how we end up at the end of that traffic stop. Did you get a
Yeah.
citation, or did
Right.
you get a warning?
Because this is where the disparity
Right.
seems to, where does the disparity actually arise? I guess I'm trying to pinpoint. Where is the disparity rising?
At the decision at the stop. After the stop, there's very little disparity. So the outcome is basically what we would expect. It's the stop
The
itself.
stop
Them getting
itself.
stopped,
Okay,
right.
all right. Well, these are things we're going to be working on, I'm sure. Is one of our, I mean, obviously, professional training is the key, and I know that as a young person, I had all the biases of my dad, because I'd hear them at the dinner table all the time, and I had to unlearn quite a few of them. And I don't even know if he probably didn't unlearn a bunch of them in his lifetime. But, you know, I grew up in a period when every different racial group had a nickname or a slang name, and, you know, that would be considered inappropriate today. So obviously learning and unlearning or relearning is one of the keys. So training, and I appreciate the fact that our Police Training Institute has high professional standards, because, I mean, this is going to be the key to the whole thing. Now, is one of the solutions having a greater diversity in the police force, so that if we're recruiting police officers, we're trying to find as many policemen of color who can police those areas of our community which have larger populations of color, so that there is a sympathetic or synchronistic relationship established already on that basis in the areas, or is that not a goal of our community policing?
Absolutely is a goal. We're constantly trying to find new ways to recruit minorities into the police force. Absolutely.
Okay, because my assumption would be that if a person is stopped by a person of his own race or even gender, they might feel less under duress, or, you know, I don't know, ill-advised. It might just feel more fair. I guess is what I'm trying to accomplish here. And I may be wrong, but.
Yeah, no, I think it's the goal from, and I've traveled around the United States talking to chiefs and sheriffs in different organizations. It's the goal of every chief or sheriff to have their police agency represent the population.
Right.
Right? I mean, that just makes sense.
Mhm.
But there's also some other research, and, you know, their research may contradict others, or it may be based on the city. Is it New York? Is it Urbana? Is it wherever? But there's also some research and some theories that even if you're an African-American officer, you're a police officer and you're blue. Every
Yeah.
cop is blue.
Right.
So now you're one of the cops. So it doesn't always work in the favor, but overall, I think it is, and over time, and to increase that diversity, I think definitely is a positive thing, and everybody's trying to do that, whether it's, you know, racial minorities, women, and that's gotten better over time. We're
We're
still
all-
kind of around that 12%
We're all
for female.
learning
So,
all the time.
Yeah.
And if we didn't have to learn any more, we probably would be having a perfect society, but we don't have that. All right, well, thanks. I think I'm going to be very excited about watching the progress of this, and I'm going to let other people talk.
Mr. Brown.
Yeah, thanks for coming, and congratulations on keeping the PTI Institute in town for foreseeable future. I think it
Thank you.
speaks very highly of you and your program, and we did pass a resolution in Urbana to support it, so that probably had a lot to do with it, too.
Everything.
Everything helps. I did have a couple questions on the grant. So has this been through the IRB process yet?
Not yet.
For-
Well, it's in the
It will be,
process.
yeah.
It will be,
It's-
okay,
yeah.
because it involves
It's a little
surveys,
bit of
human
surveys and-
experimentation, basically. And then when you're picking the randomly chosen hotspot areas, is that just in Urbana, or is that Champaign-Urbana, Champaign County? How far is the grant?
Just Urbana.
Just Urbana, okay, so it's an Urbana-centered grant. I know some of us feel pretty strongly that that especially in like the Urbana townhomes area, we made a lot of progress in trying to help eliminate some of the violence that was going on there, and that was partly through community policing and targeted patrol. So I'd hate to see that get on the control list and say we aren't going to do anything there. So how's that going to work when you're picking areas to experiment with?
So it's going to be 2016, or no, it's going to be all of 2017. We're going to look at the last year's worth of data, and then we'll look at it's going to be street segments. And there's still discussions methodologically about how we'll do the selections to get on the list of then the ones that will be assigned to control, to directed patrol, and then to community policing. So I don't have a straight answer for
Okay.
that.
And then will the grant cover officer time, or is it?
So there's 3 phases to the grant. It's a 3-year project. We've been funded through phase 1. Funding for phase 2 and 3 will be contingent upon the successful completion of phase 1. So in phase 1, it goes everything up to the point of treatment. So the officers will go through the training, and then that's the end of phase 1. So it's going to be all of the surveys, and then the interviews, and then the identification of hotspots and all of the things that need to go in place for that. For phase 2, if the funding is awarded, it will pay for officer time, for overtime, to cover the additional time that will be spent in the hotspots.
Okay. Okay, great. That part sounds good. I mean, it could mean more time on the streets, and that helps. On the overall picture I got from the update basically was overall stops are down. Step stops are down, but not quite as much. So I just want to refresh my memory on the STEP programs. In the past, I know some of them have been grant funded. Some of the activity has been grant funded. Is STEP strictly assigned by you, or the?
So it is
the,
not, it's STEP, we used to, way back, I could not tell you how many years ago, it was a grant-funded thing through the state, and that has not been for years. It is funded through our budget. We have a certain amount of our overtime that we put into the STEP line item, and so we pay officers overtime to work those specific areas where we have problems. That's chosen, we have a sergeant that's in charge of that program, but he gets input like through the Traffic Commission. If we have issues there, we'll put some of the areas on the STEP enforcement details. And then where we have high accidents and those sort of things will also get on there. And then a lot of times we'll get maybe complaints from a couple neighbors somewhere, and we'll pick another spot. But then there are those notorious issue areas where we almost always are every month. So that's kind of how we decide where it's going to go.
Okay, and then is that, so we know ahead of time basically the effort that's going into this STEP program based on the budget, the overtime?
Right. So we kind of have like, this is the average amount that an hour of overtime costs.
Right.
And so
has
he
that
kind of bases it off of that. And then, you know, toward the end of the year, obviously he can hone it down a little bit more on how much more money's in that line item. We try to use it, you know, so we can go, you know, target at these areas and try to reduce
Has that line
accident.
item gone down this year, or it's about the same? Do you remember?
I believe it is about the same this year.
So it sounds like the effort, I know we have a couple more officers, so the effort actually is probably about the same as far as trying to catch people. And
So I think one of the things that is playing into the decrease in traffic stops is the fact that we have been really low on personnel to the point where earlier this year, even though we got approval to have the 2 extra officers, I still have not acquired them physically here. We have 3 conditional offers out to 3 people right now for the 57th officer, and then overhire to try to catch up. So there were so many people in training at the beginning of this year between injuries and training and officers on military leave, where we were at a critical level on the street as far as how many officers were assigned to each shift, and we actually considered maybe having to pull a couple officers back from a special assignment if anything else happened at that time. So that obviously, that coupled with the fact that we are training 6 officers since the first of the year over certain different periods of time also plays into how many traffic stops we can do when we're trying to train. So I think both of those things have a little bit of an effect on that. I don't know that it's contributing to all of it.
okay, yeah, that helps. I think helps explain some of that. And I appreciate Dennis's comments, and I think I have seen, especially on the consent search data, it makes a big difference as far as if you have a more Caucasian police force, you're going to get it wrong more often and ask for a search when there wasn't anything to find, basically. I've seen that in national data. I can't say if we have enough numbers here to make that sort of judgment. But yeah, thanks for all the work, and I'm looking forward to our discussion next week, but I think that's all the questions I have.
Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. Mr. Hazen?
Trying to think of the best way to phrase my confusing question here. Basically, my question is, have you considered trying to incorporate some type of an economic consideration into your stats? For example, when we're looking and searching for reasons for why certain segments of our society are pulled over more than others, is there any tracking to see what your vehicles are driving and that sort of thing? Because what I'm driving at here is I have a partial theory to this. You know, obviously it's going to be a lot of little reasons. One of the little reasons I suspect is that lower dollar cars are going to have more of a propensity to get pulled over because they're going to have more equipment violations. And I think there's an economic component to it. Is there any way to incorporate that into your stats? I mean, I know we keep track of the years of the vehicles, obviously, but I don't know if they're in your stats.
Yeah, so our equipment violations are about 20% of our stops. We do record the year of the vehicle. I can run that. It's a smaller number. It's a more advanced statistical method than it is here, but I can run a correlation, and it is.
I think this slide shows the overwhelming majority of issues are the moving violations, so I don't know how much that would play into.
Right, and I'm not trying to make your job more difficult by adding stats to it. It's a broad theory. For example, if you come from a lower economic background, maybe you have not attended driving classes at high school, like my kids get to attend. So you might not know all the traffic laws as much and things like that. You look at like insurance companies, they put a higher premium on red cars because people tend to speed more in red cars. So I think there's some economic component to it. I'm probably not articulating it very well, but it's just something I'd like you to consider.
In the first annual report, I did look at the year of the car, and the year of the car was more likely to be an older car to be stopped for an equipment violation, and the disparity ratio by violation is higher African American for equipment than it is for moving, but it's not, it's fuzzy.
Okay. Also, maybe if you're in a lower economic area, you might tend to work the night shift. So, that might play into it too. The times that you're out driving, the streets that you drive down, and things like that. So it's a very broad theory that I just wanted to kind of toss out there for consideration. Thank you.
Thanks.
Mr. Hazen, thank you. Mrs. Wu?
So thank you, everybody. It's great you got a grant. Congratulations.
Thank you.
And I know it's a lot of work. It takes a lot of time, so you guys deserve. So in terms of random reviews of traffic, I know that you had talked in July about looking at some of the traffic cams, not cams, sorry, the dash cams, right? And if there was an issue, you would pull somebody aside and go over it and say, hey, how can we do this differently next time? So I'm curious if you have any numbers in terms of how many times you pull random videos, how many conversations you've had, if there have been positive benefits from those.
The first part is a little easier than the last two. So the sergeants are required to view at least 3 traffic stops of every officer that is assigned to them, that they're the monitoring sergeant for. And then the lieutenants view the sergeants, any sergeant's traffic stops, they'll view them. The sergeants tend to not have as many traffic stops as patrol officers, so they'll view 3 or whatever they have, depending on which month it is and how busy it is and how many traffic stops they've done. And then the deputy chief and I will randomly, we pick officers. We have just keep track of like who viewed this officer last, and we randomly will then pick of those officers. So as far as, I don't have a number for you on the amount, we then log that. So then the sergeants are required to, then if they conduct their traffic stop review for November, and they'll make a notation in the officer log just saying that they reviewed 3 of their stops and they were done to protocol, or if there was an issue on any of them, they'll make a notation of that, and if there's an issue, they're required to speak to the officer about it, so that they say, hey, listen, this lady started talking as soon as you went up to the car, or you didn't introduce yourself, or you didn't do this, or something didn't go the way it was supposed to go. They'll be spoken to about that. So it'll be in their officer log, and then those are compiled like during evaluation time to be documented in an evaluation for the officer. I don't have a number off the top of my head, and I would have to cull through a lot of stuff because they don't raise the level of discipline. Like if it was discipline related, if it was that bad, then I would have some, I can pull some numbers fairly easily, but I don't have them right now off the top of my head. But that's the most likely thing that will happen, is that an officer has gone off script, or maybe they didn't follow the 8-step rule, or they go through and maybe they said something that wasn't right, or they gave somebody a warning for 15 mile an hour over the speed limit. That's not really officer discretion anymore. That's not, we don't consider that necessarily to be appropriate. Things like that we'll address with them whenever they come up.
So it sounds to me like they do 3 random traffic viewings a month. Is that right?
Correct.
Okay, so every officer who's out doing traffic stops is going to be reviewed every month.
Correct.
And then that's used as part of their performance evaluation? Correct.
Yes.
Okay, all right. My next question is that can you go back to the slide, Melissa, that you had before? On slide 16. One more down. Thank you. All right, so if I'm reading this correctly, you're comparing the average from 2012 to 2016 for each group, how they did in that average compared to these 2 quarters. Is that correct?
I ran out of space. It's the average of quarter 2 and quarter 3 for 2012 to 2016. So I'm looking at specifically, because there's
Okay,
seasonal
so the same
fluctuation in this,
quarters
so it's
is
the
what you're
same
looking
quarter
at.
for the last 5 years to these 2 quarters. in
Okay, so if we
2017.
look at the first line, Asians, basically 1.03 to get a citation, 0.95 to get a citation for this year, so you've got a z-score of negative 0.88, which is less than 1 standard deviation. Fine. Okay. Expected variance. All right. So my question is on that last line on Caucasian, in the warning only, if I'm reading it correctly, you've got your average of 1.02 for the previous years, and then 1.02 for this year, but then you have a z-score of 1.98.
So that's going to be with the rounding. So if we went up by the 2 or 3 point, or 2 or 3 hundredths, that's a z-score of 3. So that's a smaller one. You're right. I should have bumped that out to 3 decimal places to truly show the change. But yeah, it's a very small difference in the disparity ratio for Caucasians, especially because that's the racial group that we stop the most, makes a big difference in the z-score. So the fluctuation is so small that any fluctuation is going to be significant based on the standard deviation.
So I know that there's a lot of numbers in this table,
Yeah.
but maybe next time put the standard
Yeah.
deviation so it's easier to ascertain. All right. And then back to what Aaron was talking about and what you had talked about, Melissa, about next steps from July. There's conversation about the mayor meeting with different groups and then a report being provided. So I'm curious what the process is going forward in terms of meeting with groups and then bringing a report to council. Mayor, I think that's a question for you. Is that on the docket for the beginning of next year in January? Is that the plan?
Probably, yeah.
Okay. So when do you think we could have a report the next time Melissa gives a report so that can coincide with one another?
I'm going to have to meet with our community outreach, Preston James, and our Human Relations Office, Basilia Clark, and we'll get something scheduled. They've been doing these small group one-on-one meetings.
How do they determine if they're looking at a report? I know you've done reports in the past, so I'm wondering what the plans are for the end of the year, if there's going to be a document that we can look over for
Yes.
the entire year.
So we did discuss that on Melissa, based on her now having done 4 quarters of this year, that compiling all of that into an annual report, IDOT report for the first of the year.
Okay, great. And so one of the things that I noticed, I went through and I looked at the previous 2 presentations before this meeting, and I see a lot of the tables are very similar. They're giving us the same information. So what I'm kind of hoping to see for the next year is to have that formal report, and then as we go through the quarters updating it, we can slide in those updated tables for that quarter because we'll have that whole structure laid out. I mean, that's ideally what I would like to see for the next year. All right. Thank you.
2 other questions, Rick.
You, Mr. Emmons.
So when you say that the crime more calls for service, do we see that all across the board in any area of the community where we see more calls for service? Do you see an automatic uptick in traffic stops?
What I can do now is I can do the overlay. There's a way to look at statistically the correlation between areas of high and high. I am not at the point where I am able to do that yet, and I am working on it, and I have an intern, and we're moving towards being able to do that statistically. Right now, what I can show you is just kind of the overlay. So we can look at the.
But you understand my question is just basically that.
Yeah. So there's an area, so over here,
Mhm.
this is Walmart. We don't have high traffic stops here because of, well, do I have it? Well, okay, so I didn't do the full overlay, but we don't have high traffic stops over here. We have high calls for service here because we're responding to shoplifting and other retail-based calls for service. So it's, yeah, there's some variation, but there's a lot of concentration both with traffic stops and with calls for service.
So it triggers one of my other questions that I had for earlier was, since, for instance, in the North side of Urbana, in my ward, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, I don't know, 6 or 7, at least 6 apartment complexes over there. Of these high calls for services that are attributed to the north side of Urbana, how many of those calls, or what percentage of those calls come from those apartment complexes?
I don't think I'm going to have a percentage for you right now off the top of my head.
And I'm sorry, I'm not expecting you to answer
Is this
that
the calls for
specifically.
service one? So obviously Lincoln Avenue is on there, and there's the one that's just north of Lincoln Avenue. There are two north of Lincoln Avenue on the west side, and then there's one that's south, closer to Sunset. I don't know, can you see that on the map? I can't see it from here, but I mean, that's going to show, yes, I mean, we have apartment complexes, and we do have calls for service there, but as far as actually pulling the numbers from those versus the other areas, we'd have to pull the numbers.
Well, I just want to make sure that we do that, because it's important. The perception is that when you say that there are high calls for service in the north side of Urbana or something, the perception is that it's all residential, right? And I don't think, I'd just like to see how much of that is actually students or young people in these apartment complexes making up those calls for service, right? As
Right, and I
opposed to
think the
just
heat map shows that. They'll show where
It's
the,
kinda hard
where
for me
the,
to see. I
right,
can't
but I'm
tell.
just saying that it does show where the concentration of calls for service are. They're clearly not all on Lincoln Avenue, but Lincoln Avenue is also a really bad place to try to, because we have a lot of speeders there, period. So officers, even whether they're on a step detail or not, will run radar there a lot because of people fly down that road, and it's a main thoroughfare for people going to the university if they work there, or to games if they're going there for sporting events and things like that. So, you know, even if that does have high calls for service, it's going to have high traffic stops regardless of whether there are calls for service there, at least along Lincoln Avenue. It will be kind of hard to differentiate, at least on that particular thoroughfare, about that particular issue.
So on Lincoln Avenue, for instance, do we have an actual breakdown? So for me, when I'm asking these particular questions, it's not a hypothetical type of question for me. I'd actually like for you to answer the question either now or at a later date. But the number of people, or the breakdown by ethnic group of the people stopped on Lincoln Avenue, I thought there may have been something that you had around that, but I'd like to see an actual breakdown, since it's a main thoroughway and, you know, folks trying to get to the university or something like that. I'd like to see the actual breakdown of each ethnic group on Lincoln Avenue.
If you want to perhaps email me or get with me later and let me know the boundaries on Lincoln Avenue that you're interested in, how far north and how far south, then I can certainly break down the traffic stops just looking at the ones on Lincoln Avenue.
I would go from Killarney all the way to Kirby.
Okay. And then to speak to your earlier, talking about the concentration of crime and calls for service, what we're looking at here is the geographic concentration, or the geographic density. What it seemed that you were speaking of earlier is the crime rate, and that's normalized for the population. And those are two very important but very different things to consider. This is more about where police resources are concentrated geographically. The other is more of like safety in an area.
What is the crime rate for the city of Urbana?
It depends on how you're looking at it, with violent or property or UCR, or there are lots of different ways to look at it. Our violent crime
Chief,
is...
could you answer the question?
No, not off the top of my head. I can't give you like I said, a definitive answer. We do a lot of statistical polling. We do a lot of reporting to the state and federal government. We can certainly get you some data on that for sure. I mean, but I don't know, not off the top of my head. I can't give that to you.
I would like to see that, yeah.
Okay.
Last thing I think 2 questions. One is, how does, and I guess, Mayor, this is a question for you. I think Mary Alice was alluding to it. How does Preston and Ms. Clark determine who to meet with in the community?
They started out by issuing an invitation to many, many different ministers, I think also through the Ministerial Association. And the first meeting we had was here in the city building, and 2 people attended, and it was, it took weeks to get that one set up. And from that first meeting, then 2 other meetings have occurred with those pastors, and then a couple of others at each meeting. It's not been for lack of effort. So it's been very, very hard to get people with very busy schedules together, as I'm sure you can understand. We have not reached out to hold neighborhood meetings, and that I will turn to council members to help get those set up, because you know best where to meet and who to meet with in your neighborhoods. So if you'd like to be the first one to help get that organized, I'd appreciate the help with that.
Yeah, no one's reached out to me
I know,
to ask
we
me
haven't.
that.
We haven't yet.
And then the one thing I wanted to point out is something that was shared with us maybe a couple years back, at least a year back, was when I watched the council meeting for July 24th, I heard Mr. Roberts in particular allude to how people feel when they get stopped, or may have been Bill. And I do think that that's an important part of it, and that speaks to community policing and all that type of stuff. But there's also a very economic impact, Dean, that's very real also. And one of the stats that was shared with us by Mr. Cruz a long time, I don't know how long ago it was, but just looking at over a 9-year span where we talked about the traffic stops and the actual impact, we're talking about in Urbana $413,880 basically extracted from the African American community. And so I just sort of think it certainly speaks to any concerns around low income or access to better vehicles and all that kind of different stuff. We certainly don't need to see, and if you add Champaign, $941,000, you're talking about $1.3 million that's taken out of what is considered to be one of the poorest sections of our communities, based solely on traffic stops, right? And a large percentage of them not being, there's no major crime that has been committed or anything like that. And I understand we can't just ignore, traffic violations, but when we see this, so now we're talking about the 362 stops. If I took at an average of $120 a ticket, another $43,000, almost $44,000 taken out of the African American community based upon traffic stops, right? Especially when you consider that it's a disparate impact. How much of that money could be saved in the African American community for our children to attend driving classes or whatever classes that we still need to attend, or whatever it is that we want to direct that money to, so that our children have better opportunities. The disparate impact, the disparity that we're discussing, we keep talking about we're working on it, but it's killing my community on a daily basis. It's extracting from my community and our community thousands and hundreds of thousands of dollars on a regular basis. That deserves more urgency, I believe, than what we are seeing at this particular point. So when the chief, with all due respect, you say, what is a reasonable request? There was a request that was offered by Mr. Cruz about how to police or how to possibly cut out some of the investigatory stops, or something like that. I'm sure he could elaborate on that if he speaks on this issue, but it was treated and received as something that's just not an option. But when I look at these hundreds of thousands of dollars being taken out of my community, I don't know how we say that something's not an option if we say we're serious about addressing it. So I'm hoping that we'll also see this beyond how the African American community feels about being stopped, because I do think that's important, but to actually look at what the daily economic impact is on our community, on the African American community in particular, on a regular basis. So that's it for me.
Thank you, Mr. Ammons. Any other council member? Oh, Ms. Wu.
Aaron reminded me of a question that I had, and I apologize. So I was looking at Darrell's email that he sent to council back in July, and he had a question about pretextual stops, and I don't know anything about pretextual stops. I was hoping you could educate me a little bit on that.
Yeah, so that is, I think he was referring, if I recall, to what we have on here as a, go back to that slide there.
The community caretaking?
No, the targeted patrol. So we're in an area, for instance, it's had a lot of motor vehicle burglaries or something, and you see someone driving, maybe making some, whatever the violation is, where they didn't completely stop at the stop sign or something, and you stop them because you think they're driving slowly around looking for places to break into, or that's why you stopped them. You're targeting that for a specific reason versus you're not really stopping them because of moving violation of the stop sign. You used that as a reason to stop them, to question them about why were they driving slowly down the street? Were they looking for, victims or, houses to break into, or what were they doing? You were trying to have basically a stop investigating them for something else than what the actual violation was. So that's why we track this motivation for the stop. It was just a different language.
So it's the same thing, the pretextual stop is the same thing as a targeted patrol?
That's what I believe he was referring to. Yes.
Okay, all right. Yeah.
I'm using that violation as a stop for another reason, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so, yeah.
I mean, that could be a headlight or tail light too, but I'm still, my intent, my motivation was to investigate something else.
But, yeah, and that will always be put into the targeted patrol bucket, so to speak. It would not be put into traffic issue or community
Correct.
caretaking. Okay,
Correct.
because that, I think, perhaps is a misunderstanding, either on my part on how I'm reading this email or something else, because, thank you.
Any other council members?
I think that
Mr. Ammons?
that non-step issue that I was raising earlier also is something that speaks to the pretextual stop too, because if an officer is in a beat area that has been described as a high crime area or a high cost for service area, certainly the discretion of the officer, my lived experience tells me that that officer will indeed say, there's a reason for me to stop this individual, right? So I think it's kind of hard to differentiate between what is a targeted patrol and what is actually part of this non-step or this that particular disparity when an officer is working in a beat, right? Because that's just my experience, that this officer is not going to always just say, hey, I'm stopping this person strictly for this motor vehicle violation. There's certainly, given the crime or the violence that we're experiencing in the community, if an officer sees a vehicle that could possibly be carrying somebody that they thought was wanted in a shooting or something, and you find out that that's not the person, you can still issue a ticket or motor vehicle violation, but the motivation was something different than what was actually written down or what was documented.
Right, that's what we're tracking here with this particular category. They have to mark a box. That's where these numbers come from. So every traffic stop, we have to issue something. If I stop you, I have to give you a citation or a warning. Once in a while, there are a few categories where we just fill out a field interview card for. But some piece of paper has to be generated, period.
So you're saying that the motivation, the checkbox for motivation is what allows you to differentiate between what I just described?
Correct.
Okay.
And
Yes, the
there's now
officer marks that.
an additional piece of information that we collect that's marked on the ticket, and it's very arduous to try and go through, and this will be electronically available to me now that I'll be able to analyze it starting January 1st, but it's the beyond scope. Do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, so if it goes beyond the scope of the traffic stop, so in the example I used earlier, I've stopped you for, you didn't stop at that stop sign, or you rolled through the stop sign, and then I start asking you other questions because I really stopped you because I thought you were trying to scope something out, and I start doing that, then I've gone beyond the scope of the traffic stop. So if I do that, then there's going to be we're starting to track that. That's what she spoke to earlier in January 1st. So we're going to start having that electronically put in so that it is a searchable thing. Right now, you literally have to go through hand by hand to get that particular data. So that was one of the things she spoke to earlier.
Mr. Roberts.
And talking with neighborhood groups and people who participate in Neighborhood Watch, I know that the same dynamic is occurring in neighborhoods as people are seeing events happening on their block that they consider suspicious. No crime has been committed, but the suspicion requires them as observant neighbors to call 911 to ask for confirmation or or just to check something because of their concerns. So applying that in a traffic stop seems to me similar to a neighbor who has a suspicion or concern for the safety of the house next door making the same kind of call without yet having a break-in.
I'm sorry, was there a question too? I mean, I understood what you were saying.
No,
Okay.
I'm just thinking.
Yeah.
Having participated in neighborhood conversations
Right.
about concerns for a neighborhood, I see that there's a parallel paradigm or action with the same result as you're looking for community safety.
I would agree with that.
Okay. Mr. Hazen.
After listening to Mr. Amma's response, it occurred to me that maybe I wasn't clear on what I was saying. I wasn't talking about the impact of writing a ticket to somebody who has less money than to somebody who has means. Although, and I wouldn't argue that that's an issue. Obviously, it's going to hurt the person without money a lot more than it is going to hurt the person with money. What I was simply suggesting, just to make sure everybody understands, is that if you have, for lack of better words, a junkier car, you live in a higher crime area, and you drive around at certain times of the night, that you are more likely to get pulled over. And I'm offering that as a suggestion, an alternative to the implicit bias theory, that there might be some other elements to this other than just somebody's race. To put it in a more simple terms, let's say I took Charlie here and put him in a high crime neighborhood and put him in a car that was 25 years old and told him to work the night shift. He would get, my theory would be that he would get pulled over far more then than he does now in his current neighborhood driving his newer car working the day shift. And that's what I was saying, because I know a lot of times that, especially at night, the officers can't even tell who they're pulling over. So I attribute a certain amount of this to economics. You're stuck in that neighborhood because you don't make a lot of money. You're stuck in that car because you don't make a lot of money. You're working at midnight because you don't make a lot of money. And when your car breaks down, you probably can't fix it. You probably haven't been to defensive driving school. You may not care as much about your driving record or your insurance rates because you just haven't been exposed to that information. And that's simply where my theory was going, and I wanted to separate that from what Aaron was saying. And sorry for using you for an example, Charlie. You just look the part.
I would be on a bike, a 25-year-old bike.
And make a point, sir.
That looks very suspicious.
All right, I just had a couple quick points. Melissa, is it possible to get us these charts or these overlays in larger format?
Yeah, this will be available on PDF format. I'll send it to the person that does the website, and so these can be online, and you can zoom in.
I looked through the past maps on the past
Is it not
slides,
so good?
and they're not.
Okay.
They're not. There's room for improvement. I mean,
Yeah.
I couldn't really get down into the nitty gritty of
Yeah, it won't
you can
change
al-
the
you-
scale.
You can almost tell, but you can't quite tell exactly where something. Like, for example, one of the brightest spots on the map is on University Avenue, just to the east of Lincoln Avenue, and it looks like it's Carl Hospital, but I can't tell exactly if that's it's just sitting on top of Carl Hospital the way you can tell Walmart is out there in the Far East. So anyway, we don't need to figure
Yeah.
out if it's Carl Hospital right now, but if you have any way to get us a larger resolution of these that are not just what's going to be in the slides that get uploaded,
Okay.
that would be awesome. One other thing, I don't know that we can expect, but I'd like to request a presentation on this grant. I know we haven't heard about it before, and we got a little snippet of it, but I think it's detailed. It's a 3-year project. It's a big grant. We usually have every other organization that comes across our way with a big grant like this that we're involved in give a formal presentation on it, and I'd like to request that. I think that'd be reasonable. I don't know when we can schedule that, Mayor, if we can if you guys have enough information to give it to us at the next meeting, or if we want to do it 2 meetings from now, after the new year. But I'd like to put that out there.
I'll probably have to check schedules with the university because they're obviously a big part of that. So I'd have to make sure that everybody's available on whatever date.
Cool. And my last thing is that is directed to my fellow council members. We don't always get together, and we obviously, when we're in this big of a group, we can't talk about city business without calling a formal meeting and having an announcement and so on and so forth. So I just want to put this out to you guys that I know we're going to have another discussion about this next week, and I think we're all kind of in the same training where, you know, it's like Sylvia said, we're kind of looking for something to do. We're looking for, you know, how do we move forward? What are we going to do about this? I think the data has been solidified. I don't think we can bang our heads on it anymore to figure out the fact that we have a problem. We need to solve it. And I think we all know that it's not going to be an overnight solution. But, you know, us as council members, we're charged as leaders of this community to help, you know, figure these things out. And, you know, I know Durrell wanted to get his commission, but seeing as that's probably not going to happen. I think it rests on our shoulders, and I think all of us are as concerned and intelligent, as thoughtful as I could ever hope a group to be. So for next time, I would just like to challenge you all. Let's look for solutions, and let's talk about the process. You know, if we're not happy with the way that it comes from, you know, what Melissa's doing to us in the quarterlies, to the annuals, let's try and come up with some ideas of what we really think is going to be productive moving forward, and we can share it with you all during the session, and we can give some, you know, clear guidance. All right. Is there anything else from any other council members? Oh, Mr. Jacobson, you got one more.
Yeah, I hate to ask you to slice the data one more way, Melissa, but when we were on Traffic Stop Study Task Force, and I did this enormous amount of reading to try to figure things out as much as I could from the peer-reviewed literature, one of the things that's very clear from the peer-reviewed literature is age-normalized accident rates are essentially the same for African American and Caucasian drivers. There is no significant difference. So because I was looking for, can you explain things by, you know, one group being more reckless drivers? But the other issue is younger drivers have more accidents than older drivers. So I guess what I'm asking, maybe this is really hard to tease out, to what extent are these racial discrepancies related to differences in the age demographics of the driving populations between, and I guess that could be, I guess the ages of all the people who are stopped would be part of the official record. So I feel kind of like piling on, but
So I will say, I've played with this a bit. I have to expand the pool for accidents. I have to go back further, and we didn't collect the same data on accidents as we did. I think 2013 was the cutting point for that. Our accidents for, I can come back to this because I'm remembering, and I want to make sure that I'm remembering correctly, but I believe that our accidents for older Caucasians are higher than than any other racial group that we see, and then I believe in the Asians driving demographic, it's higher in the younger group than any other demographic that we see. But I can look at that a little bit more.
I guess in the interests of full disclosure, I should say that I have reached the age where the accident rate starts to turn up.
All right. Well, thank you all for all your time, and we appreciate everything you all are doing.
Thanks.
All right. So we're going to move on to some very brief resolution ordinances. We have the Scott Test Program coming up. First up, we've got resolution number 2017-12-075R, a resolution accepting an Ameren, Illinois Energy Efficiency Staffing Grant Incentive. Mr. Scott Test.
Thank you. The city received a grant from Ameren, Illinois. We're going to use this grant to perform some engineering analysis, to hire some engineering analysis of our Guaranteed Energy Savings Project. That analysis is required by state statute, and the grant is prorated based on the actual energy savings versus the expected energy savings, which means we don't receive the money until the project is finished. There will be a budget amendment at a later date, along with other budget amendments. So this resolution is just authorizing the mayor to accept the grant. And we'll be having some updates on the Guaranteed Energy Savings Project in the near future. Right now we're evaluating financing options for that project.
Thank you. Any questions for Scott? Mr. Ammons?
Move that we move resolution number 2017-12-075R to council with recommendation for approval.
I'll second.
All right, moved by Councilmember Ammons, seconded by Councilmember Roberts. Is there any further discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye. Aye.
Any opposed? All right, seeing none, that will move forward to council. All right, next up we have ordinance number 2017-12-068. This is an ordinance approving amendment number 1 to a power purchase agreement with WCP Solar Services, LLC. Scott Tess.
So the original agreement approved by City Council last year was a solar power purchase agreement whereby the company WCP Solar would install, operate, own, and decommission a solar array, and the city would purchase all of the electricity that it produced and pushed into our arbor shop and for a fixed price. And the agreement last year had a technical error. The agreement had a legal description of the property that the solar company would utilize. It would be at our closed landfill where our arbor shop is located. However, the legal description was for the entire 26-acre parcel, something to that effect, when they really only needed a very small portion of that. And that's problematic in that it gives them control of that entire parcel, which is not our intent. And it also puts the property tax liability, this portion of the property which the company is using, would become property taxable. It would put the entire property on them as a tax obligation. So this is a technical correction to that agreement.
All right. Is there any questions for Scott, or can I see a motion? Mr. Roberts.
Sure, why not? I move ordinance number, we're at number 8.
Yep.
Ordinance number 2017-12-068, an ordinance approving amendment to number one to a power purchase agreement with WCP Solar Services, LLC, to council with the recommendation of approval.
I'll second.
All right, we have a motion by Councilmember Roberts and a second by Councilmember Brown. Is there any further discussion? All right, seeing none, all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye. Aye.
Any opposed, same sign. All right, that motion passes, and that ordinance will move forward to council. All right, lastly, we have a debriefing from Mr. Scott on the UN Climate Conference and an update on the city's climate action plan.
So a couple of weeks ago at council, there were a few questions regarding the UN Climate Conference and a request for a report from me. And also kind of a summary update was requested for the Climate Action Plan. So I've got some prepared remarks for the UN Climate Conference, and I'll pause then and take some questions before talking about our Climate Action Plan. So I'm happy to report that one of our professional associations, ICLEI, invited me to represent Urbana in a delegation to attend the 23rd Conference of Parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. That's popularly known as COP23. The conference convened high-level negotiators, non-state actors, and the general public in a series of pavilions, presentations, and meetings for 2 weeks this November. The purpose of the high-level negotiations was to translate the Paris Agreement, which is a pledge to cut climate pollution, into concrete actions and verifiable reporting. However, the broader set of events discussed an expansive range of issues, including clean energy, climate resilience, gender, and indigenous rights. But one theme was present throughout all the events: a commitment to stay the course on the Paris Agreement and deliver a climate with under 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming to our children. It was timely that the role of subnational governments, particularly U.S. cities, has been increasing at past UN climate negotiations, because recently the Trump administration announced the U.S. withdrawal from the Paris Agreement between its ratification in 2016 and the COP23 this year. Additionally, the administration refused to host a U.S. pavilion at the conference for the first time in the conference's history. U.S. subnational governments and nonprofit organizations responded to the administration's reversal on the Paris Agreement in 2 ways at COP23. First, organizations came together to create an unofficial U.S. pavilion named the U.S. Climate Action Center. The center turned out to be larger than any other national pavilion and was located just outside the high-level negotiators zone, closer to the national government negotiators than any other pavilion. The U.S. Climate Action Center hosted panel discussions, small group presentations, and high-level negotiations, attracting current and former elected officials, corporate CEOs, climate protection activists, and other non-state actors, all within the theme of "We are still in," namely, we are still in with the Paris Agreement. Additionally, municipal, youth, indigenous, and other climate protection organizations responded to the announced U.S. withdrawal from the Paris Agreement by creating a U.S. People's Delegation to represent the majority support in the U.S. for staying the course on the Paris Agreement and halting climate pollution. As part of the U.S. People's Delegation, the professional association ICLEI, Local Governments for Sustainability, sponsored 7 delegates from across the U.S., including myself, to attend COP23. It was a privilege to have exchange with colleagues from around the world and represent the city of Urbana on the international stage. Our aim at COP23 was to share our stories and best practices in halting climate pollution and advancing the clean energy economy. In our official talks and in side meetings, we worked to reassure our partners and colleagues from around the world and that U.S. communities are still committed to the Paris Agreement and the clean energy economy. This message was very well received throughout the conference, with one non-U.S. attendee at the ICLEI USA panel stating during the question and answer period that they thought that the U.S. may advance pollution reduction further than any other country, even without federal government support. The conference closed 2 weeks ago with new statements, commitments, and initiatives. Our professional association, ICLEI, launched several initiatives at COP23, including a climate planner professional credential, new vertical and horizontal integration to climate reporting, and a collaboration for multi-level climate governance. The Cities and Regions Pavilion produced the Bonn Fiji Commitment of local and regional leaders, and that's in your packet tonight. This document reaffirms the commitment of subnational governments to halt climate pollution and develop the clean energy economy. It also calls on national governments to fully develop the implementation of the Paris Agreement by the close of the next climate conference in 2018. In addition to sharing our stories, reassuring our international colleagues, and encouraging the U.S. government to commit to the Paris Agreement, the climate conference afforded wonderful opportunities to learn from other cities and build new relationships for future collaboration. With the new Illinois Future Energy Jobs Act at hand, Urbana can look forward to advancing more local renewable energy projects in 2018 and 2019. I'll pause there.
All right. Are there any questions for Scott? Mr. Ammons.
So first of all, Scott, thank you for going to represent us. I think this is probably the premier topic for any of us, and I'd like to go with you next time. If we can arrange that, I would really like to see that. I was just wondering, in relationship to the young people who showed up and came to give us our report card 2 weeks ago, what, along the lines of what they shared, would jump out to you that was discussed at this World Conference?
Yeah, very similar themes. There are a lot of cities who have never made climate commitments that are just doing so now. Urbana has had climate commitments, climate pollution reduction commitments since 2012. There are other cities who are making commitments that Urbana hasn't made. For instance, 100% renewable electricity, 100% clean energy, carbon neutrality. And those were all pledges and commitments being announced. They were topics of sessions as well, topics of reports that we brought back. So very much similar to what was discussed at the conference.
Okay. Thank you.
Mr. Jacobson.
So I concur with what Aaron says. I don't know, all the other things that we're doing are important, but if we don't succeed collectively, humanity doesn't succeed at this, none of the other stuff will matter. And I was really pleased, no, I wasn't pleased, but I learned that, I wasn't pleased to learn, but I did learn that Champaign's grade was D. So now that doesn't mean that we should not move forward, but do you have a counterpart in the city of Champaign who could be a point of contact and who could be urged to bring them along and in fact create some kind of partnership, since we are, after all, although not a political unit, we are a geographical unit?
There are a couple folks at City of Champaign who have some sustainability-oriented responsibilities. One of the elements that ICLEI is developing coming out of this conference is integrated monitoring, reporting, and verification. That's both vertical and horizontal integration. And I'm very interested in seeing how that develops, because I think that might be an opportunity to reach out horizontally to other cities in central Illinois to engage them in doing the type of greenhouse gas accounting that we're doing.
Mr. Roberts.
And you had mentioned that one of the goals that had been discussed in the conference was the certification of, I guess, individuals who would be either instructing or evaluating the success of the programs. Could you tell us a little bit about how that's going to come about? And is it going to be on a local level? Is this like a national status profession at this point or something? Or?
It would at least be national, if not international. The partnership that ICLEI announced is with the Green Building Certification Institute, and they are a separate body from the U.S. Green Building Council, but they are the organization that does the professional accreditation for the U.S. Green Building Council, which famously has their LEED certification for buildings. So LEED certified professionals are certified by this GBCI. The same organization is apparently going to work with ICLEI to develop this climate planner professional credential. So that would certainly be a national credential, and it's not entirely clear what that's going to entail, but I suspect it's going to entail being familiar with ICLEI's greenhouse gas accounting software, which is what we use.
Does that indicate a new career for university study?
It indicates a new practice or a new expertise. I don't know that on its own it would be a career, but certainly something that that folks interested in sustainability may want to have.
Any other council members? Mayor Mo?
I mentioned it last week, but I'll mention it again. The Sustainability Advisory Commission is going to be looking at the issue of carbon neutrality and 100% renewable electricity, and they'll be coming back with a report to council. If you make a pledge, it's important to know well, what you're committing to, so that's what they'll be looking at.
Any other council members? Scott, so I had one thought for you. So something that was interesting to me reading up on the since the Paris Climate Accord come back in the news recently, and my own experience as a natural resources and environmental sciences student, with sustainability being one of the key things that we learned about. I mean, I knew that the Paris Agreement didn't have a lot of teeth to it. That was what the large problem in the scientific community was, there wasn't a lot of enforceable language in the agreement, a lot of, patting ourselves on the back, blah, blah, blah. That's almost neither here nor there, with the exception of the fact that there is a significant portion of the agreement, that is critical to its success that nobody's really talking about, and that is that, as everyone understands, carbon dioxide has a very long half-life in our atmosphere, and what is already there is not going away, and half of the problem is trying to stop pollution from continuing to be put into the atmosphere. But the other half of the problem is that we already have too much there, and that we won't be able to stop warming with the amount, even if we went to zero emissions today, we wouldn't be able to stop warming. So in fact, the goal is not zero emissions, but negative emissions, negative net emissions, which means that the world has to come up with ways to capture that carbon back out of the atmosphere, which I honestly never read through the Paris Agreement purely because it was attacked so hard by the forces that I follow, and so I never really read the teeth of it, but didn't realize that was a pretty critical part of the agreement, was that everyone is like under this impression of, oh, well, we're going to have to do carbon capture, and a lot of countries are kind of delaying action because everyone's under the assumption that between now and 2050, some kind of amazing technology is going to emerge that's going to allow us to backtrack all the over expenditure that we're currently doing right now. I was just wondering, A, if you were aware of that, and B, if there is anything that you think the city can put into our program, because I don't see anything about carbon capture or removal from the atmosphere in ours, where things like forestation, planting, things that we know work that are tangible for the city to produce. I didn't see really any language in there in our climate plan, and I was wondering why not.
Sure. So there's a exhaustively researched book out, recently published, making the very point you've made. And the title of the book is called Drawdown. And it says, yeah, we need to stop emitting greenhouse gases, but we also need to draw down the ones we've already got in the atmosphere. And the book describes what its research concludes is the 100 most impactful ways to reduce emissions and then draw down emissions. And coming back to Urbana for a moment, our climate action plan talks about cultivating our urban forest. That's the big carbon sink that we have control over. And one really important, not flashy, but extremely important element of maintaining that carbon sink is maintenance of our urban forest, which means tree trimming. And it seems like something that it's sort of like sweeping the floor, but it's extremely important because our trees will not survive as long without proper maintenance. And I know the Arbor Division cares a lot about this, from wanting to maintain a healthy forest. Obviously, our urban forest does a couple of things. One, pulls carbon out of the atmosphere and puts it into wood. Second, it shades pedestrians, so they're more enticed to walk rather than drive a polluting car. And then three, it shades our homes so that we don't have to use as much electricity coming from coal-fired power plants in part. So enormously powerful element in our climate action plan. My understanding of our current urban forest is that we have funding to sort of maintain. We were set back significantly with a lot of work regarding the emerald ash borer and having to remove a lot of ash trees. And so where we're at now is a roughly equal amount of trees that come down each year, roughly equal to the trees that we're putting in. The Arbor Division is working on some new strategies to increase our urban forests. But that's the big carbon capture, carbon sequestration element that we have control over. Going back to the book for a moment, there are a lot of strategies in the book in terms of carbon sequestration that are actually related to agricultural strategies. And it's very interesting to read, but it's not something we have any direct control over because we don't have agriculture in the city. It may be cause to engage with folks at the state level, but we're moving out of our narrowly defined footprint at that point.
Gotcha. I just wanted to put that out there, as I think that the urban forest aspect, doesn't get a lot of the flash that a lot of the flashier renewable technologies get in our strategy, but it's absolutely as critical, if not more critical, than anything else that we're doing to reduce our carbon footprint. And if staff weren't already on that, I think that it deserves more attention than it has gotten in the past. But just a thought. Mr. Jacobson.
So this hadn't occurred to me until just now, but those of us who are connected to the university ought to start pushing the university to have the campus more forested. If you fly into Willard Airport, you fly over this great forested expanse in Urbana, and then this great open space around the university. And that's for university people are supposed to be smart. And I can only say that that's just stupid.
Just to give some quick reference, I mean, every little bit matters, but I think the estimation of the number of hectares of that would need to be planted would take up around 60-something% of arable land on the planet to be able to recapture all the carbon, if that was the only strategy that was being pursued. Now, that's not saying that we shouldn't encourage the university for more cover. I think Urbana is doing its part, but anywhere where we can, I just want to make council members and staff aware that that's an issue we should get a handle on if we can. All right, any more questions for Scott? Mr. Brown.
I guess we've kind of started talking about the action plan. We're going to make a more formal presentation on that.
I was just planning to make a couple of brief remarks, but we can just get right
Okay.
into it if you've got a question.
Just in general, I think in order for any of our strategies to succeed in the long term, be sustainable, they need to be economically sustainable. So there has to be an economic plus to them in order for people to continue with them. And so conservation, it's easy to see how that saves money when you conserve or increase your insulation, stuff like that. And our renewable energy credits work because that's just a small part of what goes into wind power production, and the federal tax credit, which might be going away over the next few years, if not sooner, makes up the biggest part of that. But wind energy is apparently getting more competitive. So that's one source. I suppose some of these cities that are pledging 100% might have more hydropower available or something like that. But it seems like there's a limit to how much you can subsidize things, and they have to have an economic return. One thing that's not in our climate action plan, and I've kind of brought it up in different ways before, is to consider that Urbana is not just a living community, but also a working community, and the fact that 33,000 people work in Urbana, even though we only have 20,000 workers. We have a lot of people that come from out of town. And one way to make our city more sustainable, when you look at it holistically, is to get more of those people to live closer to where they work. So basically to live in Urbana, which is an economic plus for us, but it's also a huge sustainability issue. If you can, say, take 5% of those people and get them to move to closer to where they work, instead of commuting 10 or 20 miles a day, they're going to be maybe walking or biking. And so that translates into hundreds of thousands of gallons of gasoline a year. So I think we need to keep that in mind, that just making our community in general, which is really something that we have a lot of control over, making our community in general more attractive place to live and to work, and making sure that we're not excluding people who want a certain type of housing, and that's why they've chosen to live 20 miles out in the country, because they couldn't find that type of housing in Urbana because we didn't think it was environmentally sustainable to have, you know, a quarter-acre yard or something. And I'm not saying that's what it is, but if that's what the developments, you know, that people want, if that's what they want, and that'll get them to live closer to where they work, I don't think we should stand in the way of that. So, in basically all of our, any of our regulations that might prevent people from wanting to live here, I think we need to look at carefully to make sure that the people who work here should be able to live here, and just, you know, and that's one of the reasons we work closely with the Park District and the school district and try to emphasize, you know, the quality we have there. So I guess my question about the Climate Action Plan, where that comes in, is it just seems to kind of end at our borders, and we know that life isn't like that, and maybe that's what some of that horizontal stuff you're talking about with ICLEI gets into. But is there potential in the action plan to kind of consider that sort of thing more about, you know, workforce demographics and workforce impact, not just residential, and the businesses? I guess you do take that into consideration, how much power the businesses use, but the activities of the people who are working here has a big impact, and that has something we can affect, I think.
Yeah, the Climate Action Plan doesn't have any content regarding workforce development or you know, folks who are working here but not living here. Perhaps with the exception, as you mentioned, with a focus on commercial building energy use. We ran a commercial buildings energy challenge for 3 years and engaged building owners and managers to benchmark, track, and reduce their energy use on the free Energy Star Portfolio Manager. So in that sense, some of those folks certainly were workers that were here but not residing here. It's an interesting comment. There are some workforce development incentives in the new Future Energy Jobs Act specific to solar developments. We're currently working with a solar developer to, in sort of a public-private partnership model, to develop a 2-megawatt solar array is our intention on the closed landfill. And it's not certain which, there are many different types of incentives in the Future Energy Jobs Act. It's not certain which we will pursue, but you know, workforce development ones are, is an incentive we could pursue on that project. And I'll also mention, as you're aware, we've run the Solar Urbana Champaign program for 2 years. In 2 years, we've installed, this is something we've run countywide. In 2 years, residents have installed over 1 megawatt of solar across, I think, over 100 different solar arrays on homes and businesses. So these are all small solar arrays. So very successful program, one of the most successful of its type in the country. And we're evaluating with our partner, the Midwest Renewable Energy Association, as to whether we will pursue that project again for a 3rd year. Our 2nd year was quite successful, so I'm thinking we're going to pursue that for a 3rd year. And then we're also with an intern, we're exploring, investigating the feasibility of small-scale wind turbines. There's descriptions for that in the city zoning to make sure it's appropriate in certain zones, but we're just in the exploration phase for that right now.
Mr. Jacobson and then Mrs. Wu.
How prominent, either in the international discussion or in the Urbana plans, is geothermal heating and cooling?
Not prominent in the international discussions. Solar has seen hardware costs plummet so substantially in the last 10 years that it's on everyone's mind. Wind energy continues to decline in price and be more affordable. a whole array, interestingly, at the international conference, is that a whole array of related human development, economic development, social development, co-benefits with the clean energy economy and reducing climate pollution are discussed. Geothermal I'm sure there was a session there. There were hundreds of sessions. I couldn't see them all. In our climate action plan, we don't specifically talk about geothermal, but that would fall under energy efficiency. In terms of what we can do about it, there's a couple things you can think about. One is, what can we do with our own facilities? Our Guaranteed Energy Savings Project is essentially working with an energy services company who does a treasure hunt for energy savings. Geothermal was not one of the elements that came up as having a good cost benefit for any of our facilities. The second thing we can do is incentivize it with private businesses and homes, but we don't have funding for that, and Ameren's not incentivizing that either. I don't think ComEd is incentivizing it. I think it has a long payback period, probably longer than solar now, so that may be the reason why. Ameren has changed their energy efficiency incentives to strongly focus on low-income residents. So they're not specifically taking the biggest savers and making them available to everyone, but focusing specifically on low-income households and providing energy efficiency assistance there.
Ms. Wu?
So I was looking over the letter from Bill about the climate action plan and some of the things that you guys have been exploring, and one of the things that you talked about is the food scrap recycling. I'm assuming that's composting?
Correct.
Okay. So it says, basically it says doubling or tripling the current U-cycle fee of $3 and $10 per month if it would be a program that the city would adopt. So I'm assuming that's $6 to $9 per household per month.
Right.
In order to do that. Is there a reason why it's so high?
Well, just like recycling, we've got to hire a vendor to drive a truck down every single street once a week. That's a substantial cost. Also, the sale of the finished product, that compost fertilizer, is not enough to pay the total costs of the processing itself. So, for instance, if we imagine such a process of having food scrap composted at the Landscape Recycling Center, the Landscape Recycling Center isn't totally funded by product sales. They have a tipping fee on the front end for folks who want to dispose of organic material, landscape trimmings at this point. And they have a fee at the back end when they finish a product and sell it. So the same would be true for food scrap composting. The facility, whether it's our facility or another facility that doesn't exist anywhere nearby that would be commercially viable, the facility would have to charge a tipping fee on the front end, plus have a market and charge a fee for the product at the back end, plus someone's got to pay the cost of the collection, driving a garbage truck up and down the streets. So that's all the costs that are involved there. Well, there are more costs. Providing collection cans, for instance, is another cost we'd have to cover. And so those numbers are based on what we've seen for prices in other communities that have done this.
Have you looked into bundling the two, recycling and compost? And I'm just thinking, when I go out to California, there's one truck that picks up 3 different bins, right, and throws them with this robot arm and throws them in. So I'm sure there's one truck that does 2 bins instead of 3 bins.
Yeah, so that's something we could evaluate. We would need to do a couple of things to make that viable. One, it had to be the same vendor, right, because it's the same truck. There may be a trade-off that diminishes savings. So if you have 2 different types of material in the same truck, that means you have half as much capacity for each material. So does that mean you're driving, you're stopping your route, driving to the processing facility twice as often? There may be a trade-off that's not desirable there. Additionally, where the recycling goes and where the commodities recycling and where the organics would go are 2 different facilities. So in terms of routing efficiency, I don't know if there's a savings there.
Yeah.
We'd have to evaluate
All
it.
right, makes sense. Thank you.
Mr. Ammons.
I actually had a question along those lines for the, around the food scrap recycling that we're discussing. If you have to drive a truck up and down the streets that's doing, you know, polluting the air basically through emissions and stuff like that, and also giving Bill Gray headaches with damaging the street at the same time, is it a savings in the end?
Yeah, I don't know if anyone's done that sort of life cycle analysis. That would be important to investigate. There are other benefits other than the strict, greenhouse gas pollution from the truck versus savings from composting food scrap rather than putting it in the landfill. Aside from that strict comparison, there are other benefits from composting. We would supplant what might otherwise be chemical fertilizer purchases with organic fertilizer purchases. We might be increasing soil carbon rates, which would be just another element that we might have to figure out in terms of the life cycle. We might be generating revenue for a city operation if it was the landscape recycling center. And then we're also limiting or reducing our use of landfill space. So, we have landfills that we send garbage to, but sooner or later they fill up and then we have to permit another landfill somewhere else, and that's new land that can't be used for another purpose. So how do you value those different ones? In terms of the strict, carbon accounting, I haven't seen a life cycle analysis. Probably someone's done at least a back of the envelope, and would want to know about that before we pursued it further.
Food scraps going into, just about all food scraps are going to decompose, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the food scraps that go into a landfill that has all types of things that go into it, it's not really eating up a lot of that landfill space then, right? The traditional landfill space, because it's going to decompose. I'm just sort of thinking out loud, but I'm intrigued by it in so many ways. Pragmatically, we know that individuals, we can ride bikes, we can walk, we can do those various different things to help reduce emissions. Just how effective is it for individual families to compost their own scraps? I mean, is there a way to measure that impact in a community or on a family basis or something like that?
There's probably a calculator that someone has put on a website that says a pound of food scrap or a ton of food scrap equals this much. The distinction here is if we put food scrap into a landfill, it decomposes in an oxygen-free environment. That results in methane, which is a very potent greenhouse gas. Mm-hmm. If we put it in a compost facility with a windrow turner where it gets oxygenated, it does not produce nearly as much methane. So that's where the savings is. In terms of what the marginal impact of, say, one household that does backyard composting, I don't know that off the top of my head, but all these sorts of things, there tend to be calculators.
Well, the reason why I posed it is, one, I compost, and I want to feel good about it. The other thing is, when you talk about people doing these things on when they're multiplying it and more people are doing it, I don't know if I know I'd like to be able to share that with other people to make sure that they understand the benefits of even backyard composting, right? One person riding a bike may not save the world, but of course when you start, thanks to Charlie having bike lanes all everywhere, right? Then that has a major impact. So I'm just saying it grows, right? Yeah. The impact of that grows. And I didn't know if there was some, is there a negative side of that? When I compost in my backyard, is it getting the oxygen? It's getting the oxygen it's supposed to get, or am I producing methane in my backyard? I don't know. I'm just asking.
Are you turning it every once in a while?
No, I'm not. So that's the key to it. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. And that relates to another greenhouse gas reduction activity that we do, but we don't think about, which is the U-Cycle recycling service. By recycling materials rather than making them from brand new materials, there's a pollution savings there, especially for metals, especially for aluminum. Aluminum production is very greenhouse gas intensive. And we're actually coming to the end of a U-Cycle contract. Actually, we have 2 contracts, one for curbside and one for multifamily. We've rebid that contract, and we're evaluating proposals now and expect to make an award very soon. And we expect to have a little bit of savings in this current contract as well.
Mr. Brown.
I'll just put in my 2 cents about composting. I think everybody on my block has a compost pile. I don't know how many people turn it like they're supposed to prevent methane from building up, but I also believe that the place where our garbage goes does methane capture in the landfill, so that would all have to be evaluated. And my gut feeling is that for tripling the recycling fee, there's got to be something else we could get more bang for our bucks for, rather than sending another truck down the street to pick up little pails of vegetable waste. Although, maybe the institutions have large amounts. I know you've looked at that, and institutions and grocery stores, things like that have large amounts of compost potential waste would make a lot more sense. But I don't think we should even waste too much time thinking about doing some kind of residential compost pickup. Although, where the cities where they do it, Minneapolis or San Francisco, there might be different factors in play. Bigger apartment buildings where they don't really have any other options. I know a friend of mine lives in Boston, and they actually have some community gardens where they can take their compost or their waste to compost piles where they're managed correctly. But it seems like we know there's enough people in our neighborhoods that know how to compost that if you don't want to, you can find a neighbor that'll take it, or take it, to one of the community gardens or something. But I can't see it really working here.
Okay. One last thing from me, Scott. So this is only the second time I've looked at the climate action plan, so I just had one question on methodology and 2 changes. Is this a thing that's like set in stone? Obviously a lot of time was spent on it. I'm asking because one thing that I was kind of expecting to see in it was a little more detail on deliverables. The actions are almost like deliverables, but not quite. They're generalized deliverables without being specific.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, it's hard to look at each one of these particular things and see, okay, well, what was the deliverable for that? When was the goal to have achieved it? And have we done it?
Mm-hmm.
Are we keeping up with these things?
In terms of dates, there is a table at the end. It might be in an appendix. There was I think the Climate Action Plan Phase 2 was 26 pages, and I think the appendix was 24 pages. So I
Okay,
tend
maybe
not to include that. It is on the website.
Maybe I missed that.
But there is a table, and it might be in the appendix, which I didn't print for you. And it lists all the goals line item by line item, and a start date, and a planned start date and a planned end date. Once or twice a year, I go line item by line item with the Sustainability Advisory Commission and just state where we're at. And we actually did that at our previous Sustainability Advisory Commission meeting. And so that's where we're kind of tracking that. And every month with the Sustainability Advisory Commission, I at least update them on the percent complete, percent in progress, so forth.
Excellent. I'll have to review those meetings and see if I can't get myself caught up on it. So how does some of these suggestions that we've come up with tonight, how do we add something if we wanted to add it to this action plan?
Well, I wouldn't advise changing the plan, every 6 months, but rather communicate what opportunity you have in mind. We don't have funding for a funding source for the Climate Action Plan, which means that while we've planned activities, we have intentions. We also operate opportunistically. When an opportunity arises, we don't say, well, it's not in the plan, so we're not going to do it. So, for instance, there was no sense that there would be the type of incentives for large-scale solar array development in the city on the landfill when we wrote the Clean Action Plan. That's not listed. Yet, we're pursuing that. So I would say, bring up that concept that you're thinking about, and we can discuss it here or, privately or wherever.
Okay, thank you. Mayor Brown.
It's important to keep in mind that although a large part of our land area is the University of Illinois property, that is not included in our climate action plan, even though it's still in the city of Urbana. So when the plan was developed, the goals were set with that in mind as well. The university is its own entity in terms of its climate action goals and action activities as well. So it's complicated here because of our twin city and then the university in between. So.
All right, last chance, council. All right, thanks, Scott. We really appreciate it. We appreciate all your work. And with the end of that discussion and seeing no further business before this council, let's adjourn this meeting.